Hello everyone, I am the narrator and I am here to help you today. I know you used this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Hardgrove estate doesn't want to be sold. I knew this. The moment I first stepped onto the property, felt it. In the way the floorboards seemed to exhale beneath my feet, and how the door knobs turned just a fraction too easily in my palm. But it was the windows that truly betrayed the mansion's reluctance. Each pane of glass a watchful eye, and behind one of them always the man in the black suit, his silhouette motionless against the swirling dust motes. The listing was already 90 days stale when my agency assigned it to me. 3 other agents had walked away from it. Now I understand why my name is Daniel Mercer and I've been selling high-end properties for 15 years. Haunted houses, as we call them in the business. Not because of ghosts, but because of the spectral trail of failed listings, price reductions, and desperate sellers that follow them. The Harrow Estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Blackwood, was supposed to be my white whale, the impossible sale that would cement my reputation. Instead, it's become my prison. I first noticed him during the initial property assessment. The mansion had been vacant for nearly 2 years since the last owner. An elderly recluse named Edmund Hargrove had moved to a care facility. The trust managing the estate was eager to liquidate. The property had good bones, as we say, ornate woodwork, original fixtures, a widow's walk with views of the rolling countryside, prime for renovation and flipping, despite the musty smell of neglect that permeated every room. I was photographing the library when a movement caught my eye, just a flicker of darkness passing behind the window. When I turned to look directly there, he was a tall, slender figure in an immaculately tailored black suit, standing perfectly still. Watching the house from the side garden, his face was in shadow, but I could sense his focus, predatory and patient. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rushed to the window, but the garden was empty, just dead leaves skittering across overgrown grass. I convinced myself it was just a shadow, or perhaps a potential buyer exploring the grounds without an appointment. It happens that night, reviewing my photographs on my laptop, I noticed something that made my skin prickle with goose flesh in 3 separate shots of the exterior. There he was, the man in the suit, always at a different window. Always watching in one image, he seemed to be looking directly at the camera, though his face remained frustratingly obscured. I told myself, there must be a squatter in the property. It happens sometimes with vacant homes, especially in remote locations. I resolved to conduct a thorough inspection the next day and notify the police if necessary. The caretaker met me at the gate the following morning. Mr. Finch was a hunched, weathered man who'd been maintaining the grounds since before I was born. When I casually inquired if anyone else had access to the property, his rheumy eyes narrowed. He assured me that the house was securely locked each evening, that he personally checked every window and door. No one could be inside without his knowledge. When I pressed him, mentioning the figure I'd seen, his leathery face seemed to collapse in on itself. He mumbled something about the house having eyes, then busied himself with unlocking the front door, refusing to elaborate. Despite my questions, inside the mansion felt different, colder. Despite the unseasonable warmth outside, the high ceilings seemed to trap my breath, condensing it into visible clouds that shouldn't have been possible. In April, I conducted a room-by-room search, throwing open closet doors, checking behind heavy velvet drapes, even inspecting the small cellar where the ancient boiler wheezed and groaned. Nothing in the master bedroom. I found the first photograph. It was tucked inside a leather-bound album in the bottom drawer of a mahogany dresser dated 1937. The sepia image showed the Hardgrove estate shortly after its construction, and there, standing beside the freshly planted elm that now towered over the driveway, was a figure in a dark suit. Though the quality was poor and the distance considerable, there was no mistaking the same rigid posture, the same observant stillness I'd witnessed the day before. My mouth went dry as I continued flipping through the album. Family picnics, holiday gatherings, garden parties spanning decades. Each photograph documenting the life of the house and its occupants, and in the background of nearly every exterior shot, there he was, always at a distance, always watching, sometimes barely visible in the shadow of a tree or reflected in a window, but undeniably present in a photograph. From 1963, he stood on the Widow's Walk looking down at a summer gathering below. In one from 1978, he was visible through the glass of the conservatory while the Hargrove family celebrated Christmas in the foreground. Oblivious, the most recent photo, dated just 3 years ago, showed Edmund Hargrove in his wheelchair on the front porch, and reflected in the window behind him the unmistakable silhouette of the watching man. My throat constricted, my lungs suddenly unable to pull in enough air. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. A family member with a peculiar fashion sense, a dedicated groundskeeper, but the consistency of his appearance across nearly a century of photographs made such explanations laughable. I must have stayed in that room for hours, poring over the album until the sunlight took on the golden quality of late afternoon. When I finally looked up, he was there, standing across the room near the ensuite bathroom door. My body turned to ice, sweat instantly coating my skin. Despite the chill, he was tall, impossibly tall, his suit perfectly tailored to his gaunt frame. But his face, where his face should have been, was only shadow deeper than seemed possible, as though the darkness were a tangible thing. I blinked and he was gone. The caretaker found me sitting on the bedroom floor, the album clutched to my chest. He didn't seem surprised by my state when I showed him the photographs. His gnarled hands trembling as he turned the pages, he simply nodded. The Watcher, he called him. Always been there, always will be part of the property. Like the land itself, according to Mr. Finch, every owner of the Hargrove estate had their own stories about the Watcher. Some claimed to have spoken with him, others insisted he had guided them to make certain renovations or changes to the property. All agreed that he was protective of the house, that he considered himself its true owner. Regardless of whose name was on the deed, I should have walked away, then should have returned the listing to my agency, claimed a conflict of interest, a family emergency. Anything but the Hargrove estate was a 7-figure commission, and my divorce had left me financially vulnerable. I needed this sale. Besides, I reasoned, every old house had its stories. The Watcher was nothing more than local folklore, a shared delusion perpetuated by suggestible minds to prove the property's marketability. I decided to spend the night show potential buyers that the house was perfectly habitable. If a bit dated, I would film a virtual tour at dawn when the light through the east-facing windows transformed the main hall into a cathedral of amber and gold. It was a technique I'd used successfully with other difficult properties. The caretaker tried to dissuade me, but I insisted he left me with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and a warning not to wander the upper floors after midnight. I had planned to use the smallest guest bedroom, but found myself drawn to the master suite. Perhaps subconsciously needing to confront the space where I'd seen him, I set up my laptop on an antique writing desk, reviewed the day's emails, and eventually drifted off to sleep in the 4-poster bed, the album of photographs locked securely in my briefcase. I awoke to pressure on my chest as though someone were sitting on me. My lungs strained against the weight, each breath shallow and unsatisfying. The darkness was absolute when I tried to move my arms. I found them lean, unresponsive. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. It happens when you sleep in unfamiliar places, nothing to fear. But then I felt it, fingers ice cold and slender, brushing against my throat. A whispered voice so close to my ear that I could feel the impossible chill of its breath. She needs to be completed. My paralysis broke in a surge of adrenaline. I flailed wildly, tumbling from the bed onto the hardwood floor. My hand found the light switch and the room flooded with harsh electric light. Empty, of course, it was empty. Heart still thundering in my chest. Mouth desert dry, I noticed something on the writing desk that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. Papers yellowed with age spread out across the polished surface. My legs trembled as I approached each step, requiring conscious effort. They were architectural drawings rendered with meticulous precision. The Hargrove estate, but not as it currently existed. These plans showed additional structures, expanded wings, and most disturbingly, an extensive network of chambers and corridors beneath the main house, an underground complex that, according to the drawings, extended well beyond the property's boundaries. One section was circled repeatedly in what looked like dried blood, but was probably just red ink, aged and darkened a chamber directly beneath the master bedroom labeled in flowing script. The waiting room. I checked the dates on the plans. 1898, decades before the house I was standing in had been built. These weren't renovations, they were the original vision, a vision that had never been fully realized, or had it? The floor beneath me suddenly seemed insubstantial, a mere membrane between me and whatever waited below. I remembered the small cellar I'd inspected, how the dimensions hadn't matched the footprint of the house above. At the time, I'd assumed it was just an anomaly of old construction. Now I wasn't so sure. Dawn was still hours away. I couldn't stay in that room with those plans. With the memory of that weight on my chest and that whisper in my ear, I gathered my belongings and retreated to the kitchen. The most mundane space I could think of there. Beneath the buzzing fluorescent light, I spread the architectural drawings across the marble countertop and forced myself to study them systematically, professionally. If there were hidden spaces in this house, I needed to know about them. Disclosure requirements for potential buyers, structural integrity concerns, all very rational reasons that had nothing to do with the cold dread pooling in my stomach. The plans indicated a concealed entrance to the subterranean levels, accessible through the pantry adjacent to the kitchen. According to the drawings, a specific sequence of pressure applied to certain decorative elements of the pantry's woodwork would reveal a passage. It seemed absurd, like something from a mystery novel, not a genuine architectural feature, and yet the woodwork patterns in the pantry matched those in the drawings exactly. My fingers shook as I traced the carved whorls and leaves, feeling for any discrepancy, any hint of a mechanism. Nothing happened. I was both relieved and strangely disappointed, but as I turned to leave, my elbow bumped against a particular section of molding and I heard it. A soft click followed by the groan of wood and metal that had been stationary for far too long. The back wall of the pantry swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The rational part of my mind insisted this was a significant selling feature, historic architecture. Secret passages, the kind of unique elements that justified an astronomical asking price, but that rational voice was drowned out by the thundering of my pulse, the cold sweat trickling down my spine. I knew I should wait for daylight for the caretaker for anyone else to witness this discovery. Instead, I found myself retrieving the flashlight Mr. Finch had left me and stepping through the opening, drawn forward by a compulsion I couldn't name. The stairs were worn in their centers, suggesting generations of use. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a mineral scent like wet stone and raw earth. My flashlight beam caught cobwebs and scurrying insects, but showed no signs of recent human presence until I reached the bottom. There, the narrow passage opened into a chamber much larger than seemed possible, its ceiling supported by columns carved directly from the bedrock. The room was empty except for a single chair in its center, and on the walls, hundreds, perhaps thousands of drawings. The same architectural plans I had found upstairs, but in various stages of development, showing the evolution of the design over time, and interspersed among them sketches of a figure that made my blood freeze. The man in the suit, rendered from various angles, always with that same featureless shadow where his face should be. In the furthest drawings, the shadow had begun to extend beyond the figure's head. Tendrils of darkness reaching out across the paper, and in the most recent sketches dated just months ago, the shadow had engulfed the figure entirely, leaving only a vaguely human silhouette of absolute blackness. My flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt rather than saw him enter the chamber. The temperature plummeted. My exhaled breath hung before me in crystalline clouds. I didn't need to turn around to know he was there. Standing between me and the stairs, between me and escape, she needs to be completed, came the whisper again from everywhere and nowhere. What as my voice emerged as a pathetic croak. The house, the silence that followed, seemed to confirm my question. I forced myself to turn to face whatever stood behind me. The flashlight beam passed through empty space. He was gone, or perhaps had never been there at all. I fled back up the stairs, through the pantry, out of the house entirely. The pre-dawn air was sweet and warm against my chilled skin. I sat in my car until sunrise, watching the windows of the Hardrove estate for any sign of movement. When the caretaker arrived, I showed him the hidden entrance, the underground chamber, the architectural plans. He seemed unsurprised, almost resigned. The Watcher had revealed the passages to others before he explained every few decades when he grew impatient with the estate's incomplete state. No owner had ever fulfilled the original vision. None had dared to expand into the earth as the plans dictated. I asked what happened to those who tried. The caretaker's expression shuttered his earlier openness. Replaced with wary reticence, they became part of the house. Was all he would say bound to it? As the Watcher was bound, that should have been the end of my involvement with the Hardgrove estate. I should have terminated my contract, walked away, pretended none of it had happened. But that night in my own apartment, miles from the mansion I dreamed of, the underground chamber of the chair waiting in its center, I dreamed of sitting in that chair, of being enveloped by living shadow, of seeing the estate through different eyes, the eyes of windows, watching the world pass by, decade after decade, waiting for someone to understand what the house was meant to become. I woke with my hands clutching a pencil, my fingers cramped and aching. Spread across my bedroom floor were dozens of sketches, architectural drawings showing new additions to the subterranean levels of the Hardgrove estate, rendered in a style that wasn't my own. I've taken the property off the market. I've moved into the master bedroom. Permanently, the caretaker brings meals and art supplies. I'm expanding the plans, refining them. The Watcher stands at my shoulder as I work, guiding my hand. Sometimes when I catch glimpses of my reflection in the windows, I see only a silhouette in a dark suit, featureless and patient. The house doesn't want to be sold, it wants to be completed. And I understand now that I am not here to sell the Hardgrove estate. I am here to become part of it. Story 2, the first time I saw him, he was nothing but a shadow at the edge of a yellowed photograph, a tall figure in a dark coat, half turned away from the camera, standing beneath a street lamp in a scene from 1937. Just another anonymous face among thousands I'd cataloged in the university archives, but he was looking at me, not at the photographer, at me. His face was blurred, yet somehow I knew his eyes were fixed on mine. Across the gulf of decades, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the library's aggressive air conditioning. I am not a man given to imagination. 15 years as an archivist at Blackwood University has trained me to deal in facts, documentation, and the careful preservation of history's fragments. I cataloged the dead. I organized their remnants. I do not believe they watch me back yet. There he was again, this time in a family portrait from 1952, a garden party with well-dressed guests raising champagne flutes. He stood at the far edge of the gathering, taller than the others, wearing the same dark coat. Despite the apparent summer setting, while everyone faced the camera with period-appropriate smiles, his face was turned slightly toward me. I felt my mouth go dry as I examined the photograph under the magnifying glass. The photograph had been in our archives for decades. It couldn't possibly contain a figure looking at me specifically. In 2025, sleep came fitfully that night. My apartment felt unusually cold. Despite the April warmth outside, the radiator in the corner made occasional ticking sounds that kept startling me awake. When I finally did sleep, I dreamed of dark hallways lined with photographs, all containing the same tall figure, all turning slightly as I passed. The following day, I found him in 7 more photographs spanning from 1891 to 1897, 1973. Always peripheral, always in that same dark coat, always positioned so that he appeared to be looking at the viewer, at me, rather than participating in the scene itself. My heart pounded uncomfortably as I created a separate file for these anomalous images. The logical part of my brain insisted this was nothing more than a coincidence of similar-looking men captured across different eras, combined with a trick of perspective. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that evolved to fear predators, watching from the shadows, screamed. Otherwise, I began taking photographs of my own apartment that evening, ostensibly to document a minor water leak for my landlord. The first few images showed nothing unusual. My cluttered living room with its overstead bookshelves, my spotless kitchen, my bedroom with its unmade bed. It was only when reviewing them on my computer that I noticed something in the background of one image, a dark smudge in the mirror that hung in my hallway, something that looked like a tall figure in a coat. My hand trembled as I deleted the photograph. A reflection of my own shadow, clearly nothing more. 3 days later, while documenting a new collection of photographs from the 1960s, I found him standing directly behind a group of students at a protest. This time his face was clearer, gaunt, pale with deep-set eyes, and no expression. He wasn't looking at the camera anymore. He was looking slightly to the left of it, exactly where I was sitting. As I examined the photograph, my breath caught in my throat. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead and back. I closed the archive box quickly, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain my colleague in the next room could hear it. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was overworked, that perhaps I needed to schedule an appointment with my doctor to discuss possible hallucinations. That night I took more photographs of my apartment. I told myself it was to document the strange noises coming from the pipes. In reality, I wanted proof that my home was empty of anyone but me. When I reviewed the images, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my phone in one photograph of my living room taken through the doorway from the hall. There he was, a dark figure standing in the far corner, barely visible in the shadows. In the next image, taken seconds later from the same position, he was gone. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding place in my apartment. I found nothing. The doors and windows remained locked as they had been all day. I live on the 5th floor. There was no way anyone could have entered or exited without my knowledge. Sleep was impossible. I sat on my couch until dawn with all the lights blazing, jumping at every creak and settling sound the old building made when morning came. I called in sick to work. For the first time in 3 years, the next day I returned to the archives with new resolve. I would find an explanation. I would prove to myself that this was nothing more than an odd coincidence or a product of my overt, tired mind. Instead, I found more of him now that I knew what to look for. He appeared in dozens of our archived photographs, always peripheral, always watching his face, gradually becoming clearer over time. In the earliest photographs from the 1890s, he was merely a suggestion of a figure. By the 1950s, I could make out his features. By the 1970s, I could see his eyes, dark, hollow, fixed on the viewer on me. My colleague Rebecca noticed my agitation. She asked what I was researching with such intensity the words caught in my throat as I considered how to explain. In the end, I mumbled something about a pattern in historical surveillance practices. She gave me an odd look but didn't press further. I was grateful I couldn't bear the thought of showing the photographs to anyone else, of watching their face as they failed to see what was so blindingly obvious to me. That evening, I took more photographs of my apartment. This time, he was in 3 of them in one. He stood at the far end of my hallway. In the next, he was halfway down it. In the third, he was at the near end, just a few feet from where I stood. When I took the picture, his face was clearly visible, now gaunt, pale, ageless. His eyes were dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. The photographs existed only on my phone. I hadn't printed them or shared them. There was no way anyone could have manipulated them. I was either losing my mind or something impossible was happening. I slept at a hotel that night, too terrified to return to my apartment. Even there, I woke repeatedly from nightmares in which I was trapped in a dark room with him watching as his figure emerged from the chemicals, step by step approaching me. The next morning, I returned to my apartment only long enough to pack a bag. That's when I noticed it. The pocket watch sitting on my coffee table, where no pocket watch had been before, antique silver intricately engraved with a pattern of leaves and vines with trembling fingers. I picked it up. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally heavy. I recognized it. It had been visible in one of the photographs from 1912, clutched in the hand of a proud-looking man in a formal portrait, while the dark figure stood behind him. Watching me, the watch couldn't be here. It was impossible. I dropped it as though it had burned me. The sound it made hitting the hardwood floor was too loud, too solid. This was no hallucination. I grabbed my bag and fled, the apartment door banging behind me at work. I pulled the 1912 photograph with shaking hands. There it was, the exact same pocket watch, distinctive engraving, clearly visible. My vision swam, the archive room seemed to contract around me, the silence pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I had nowhere else to go. Not really, the pocket watch was gone from the floor where I dropped it. Instead, I found a fountain pen on my desk, ornate, clearly antique. I recognized it from a 1943 photograph where it had been visible on a desk in the background. The dark figure standing nearby. Over the next week, more objects appeared. A tarnished silver cigarette case from a 1927 photograph, a leather-bound book with gilt edges from 1895, a skeleton key from 1901. Each one appeared mysteriously in my locked apartment, remained for exactly 24 hours, then disappeared, replaced by something new, and all the while I kept taking photographs. I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know where he was, how close he had come each day. He was nearer from the end of the hallway to the middle of my living room, from the corner of my bedroom to the foot of my bed. I barely ate. I barely slept at work. I moved through my tasks like a ghost. Speaking only when absolutely necessary, my colleagues' concerned glances slid off me like rain. What could I possibly tell them? That a figure from century-old photographs was stalking me, that artifacts from these images were materializing in my apartment, that each night his image in my own photographs drew closer to where I stood. The morning I found the dark coat draped over my kitchen chair, I nearly broke. It was his coat, the same one he wore in every photograph across the decades, heavy wool slightly iridescent in its blackness with horn buttons and a silk lining. It smelled of tobacco and something else, something chemical that reminded me of the archive preservation rooms. I didn't touch it, I left it there. Took a photograph from across the room to confirm its existence, then fled to work. When I returned that evening, the coat was gone. In its place on the chair sat a camera, an antique bellows camera from the early 1900s. I recognized it from several of the archive photographs. In some, the dark figure had been standing near it that night. I took my final photograph standing in my living room, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I captured an image of my hallway. He was there standing at the entrance to my bedroom, no longer a peripheral figure or a distant observer. He filled the frame, tall and thin in his dark suit, white shirt starched and gleaming in the dim light. His face was clear now, hollow-cheeked, pale as paper, with eyes like wet ink that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. He was looking directly into the camera at me, and he was smiling. I dropped my phone as if it had suddenly burst into flames. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. Sweat poured down my face and back, despite the chill that had permeated my apartment for days now. I couldn't look down the hallway. I couldn't bear to see if he was really there. Standing outside my bedroom where the photograph had shown him. The antique camera sat on the kitchen table, its brass fittings gleaming softly in the half-light. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving toward it. My hands, seemingly of their own accord, unfolded. The bellows adjusted the aperture. It was loaded with film, impossible for a camera this old. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that it was ready to capture an image. I felt his presence behind me. The air in the apartment had grown so cold that my breath fogged in front of my face. I could smell tobacco and chemicals and something else underneath the musty scent of things long buried in darkness. Slowly I turned around. He stood there exactly as he had appeared in 100 photographs, tall, thin, ancient, yet ageless. Watching me with those ink-black eyes, we stood facing each other across my kitchen, separated by mere feet of empty space that somehow felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He simply watched me. His face expressionless, save for the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that might have been a smile. Understanding crashed over me like ice water. I knew what he wanted, what he had always wanted, with trembling hands. I raised the antique camera and looked through the viewfinder through it. I could see not my kitchen and the figure standing in it, but the university archives as they had been decades ago. Different furnishings, different layout, but unmistakably the same space where I had worked for 15 years. And in the viewfinder image, standing among the archive shelves, was a young man in outdated clothes, bent over a box of photographs. I didn't recognize him specifically, but I recognized what he was, an archivist from years past. My predecessor looking up suddenly, his face registering shock as he noticed something in the distance. I understood now. I understood everything. I lowered the camera slowly and met the dark figure's gaze. Then deliberately I placed the camera on the table between us and backed away, shaking my head. His smile faltered for the first time and emotion crossed his face. Disappointment perhaps, or frustration. He remained motionless for a long moment, those ink-black eyes boring into mine, then with a movement so slight I almost missed it. He inclined his head in what might have been acknowledgement. When I blinked, he was gone. The antique camera remained on my kitchen table, but something about it had changed. It looked older now, dustier, as though it had aged decades in seconds. I approached it cautiously and looked through the viewfinder again. This time I saw only my kitchen, empty and ordinary. When I set the camera down, I noticed it had left a perfect dust outline on the table's surface, as though it had been sitting there undisturbed for years. That was 3 weeks ago. The figure hasn't returned. The objects have stopped appearing. My apartment is my own. Again, though, I still sleep with the lights on and still startle at shadows. I've continued my work at the archives, but I avoid the photograph collections. I requested a transfer to the manuscript department, citing allergies to the chemical preservatives used in photographic conservation. My request was granted with minimal questions, sometimes late at night. When the silence grows too loud, I take out my phone and look at that final photograph, the one that shows him standing in my hallway smiling at me. I study his face, those ink-black eyes searching for answers I know I'll never find. I understand the pattern. Now he finds them, archivists, curators, preservers of history, and offers them a choice, a trade. He appears in their present, they disappear into his past. Some accept, some refuse. I refused. But the true horror, the thought that keeps me awake, despite my exhaustion, is this. What happens when the next archivist years from now begins cataloging photographs from 2025? Will they see me standing in the background? Will I be watching them through the chemicals and paper growing closer with each image they discover? Will I be wearing a dark coat story? 3, the static came first, then the voice. A whisper so clear amid the crackling white noise that it froze my blood. My name, it said my name. In a broadcast that should have been from 1954, the antique Philco radio sat innocently on my shelf, its amber dial glowing with an intensity that seemed impossible for its age. I'd restored it myself, every vacuum tube and resistor meticulously tested and replaced when necessary, but I never expected it to bridge time itself, to become a window into something I can no longer explain. Even now, as I write this with trembling hands, I can hear it humming in the corner of my study, waiting, always waiting for me to turn the dial again. I've always been drawn to the forgotten, the discarded artifacts of bygone eras. My apartment is a museum of obsolescence, rotary phones, mechanical typewriters, camera obscuras, and photographs. Each item carefully restored, cataloged, and displayed. My colleagues at the university's history department often joked that I lived in the wrong century. Perhaps they were right, but not in the way they imagined. The radio came from an estate sale in Millfield, a decaying industrial town 3 hours north. The deceased owner, Herbert Gaines, had been a radio engineer in the 1950s. His grandniece, a harried woman with no interest in his collection, practically gave it away. The Philco caught my eye immediately, a 1953 model with a mahogany cabinet, its craftsmanship evident. Despite decades of neglect, she mentioned offhandedly that her great-uncle had modified it somehow but couldn't elaborate. I felt that familiar thrill of discovery as I handed over a pittance for what would become my undoing. Restoring the radio took weeks. Its internal components revealed peculiar modifications. I couldn't immediately identify custom capacitors, an unusual antenna array, and wiring configurations that defied conventional radio engineering of the period. But when I finally connected it to power, the amber dial illuminated, and the speaker crackled to life with remarkable clarity. At first, the radio behaved normally. I tuned into local stations, admiring the warm tone that modern equipment can never quite replicate. I displayed it proudly on my office shelf between a 1920s telegraph key and a Victorian stereoscope for 3 days. It was merely another triumph of restoration on the fourth night. While grading papers, I noticed the dial moving on its own. The soft click of the tuner turning incrementally caught my attention. I watched transfixed as it settled on a frequency between stations. Static hisses then cleared to reveal a voice announcing a baseball game, the Brooklyn Dodgers versus the New York Giants. The broadcaster described a play involving Jackie Robinson with such immediacy that I checked my phone to confirm the date. 2023, not 1954. My skin prickled with goose flesh as I realized I was hearing a live broadcast from nearly 70 years in the past. I stayed up until dawn listening to news reports about the Army McCarthy hearings, advertisements for products long discontinued, and jazz programs featuring musicians performing live who had been dead for decades. The rational part of my mind suggested explanations, someone broadcasting vintage recordings on an unused frequency perhaps. But the broadcast contained none of the audio degradation one would expect from archived recordings. They were happening now in their own time, somehow reaching across the decades to my shelf. My fascination quickly turned to unease. The following evening, I was fixing dinner when the radio switched itself on through the static. Came my own voice recounting a phone conversation I'd had that morning with my department chair about budget cuts, word for word, inflection for inflection. The radio played back a private conversation from my kitchen phone. My fork clattered to the floor as I stood frozen, listening to my own voice, discussing matters no one else could have heard. I approached the radio cautiously as one might a venomous snake. The moment I touched it, the broadcast shifted to static, then to what sounded like a 1960s news program. I unplugged it. My heart hammering against my ribs, sleep eluded me that night as questions multiplied in my mind. How had it recorded my conversation? Where was it storing this information? What else had it heard over the next week? The pattern intensified. The radio would broadcast from the pass swing. Music, old radio dramas, news reports, then suddenly transitioned to playback of my private moments. Phone calls to my sister, mumbled comments to myself while working. Even my frustrated cursing when I stubbed my toe in the bathroom. The radio was listening, recording, storing, always when I was alone, always stopping when anyone else visited my apartment. My colleague, Elena, from the physics department examined it. At my request, she found nothing unusual beyond my own modifications, suggesting that perhaps I'd inadvertently created some kind of feedback loop in the circuitry. She couldn't explain the broadcast from the past, dismissing my descriptions as probably vintage radio shows being rebroadcast. I didn't mention the playbacks of my private moments. The look in her eyes already suggested concern for my mental state. The true horror began when the radio started revealing secrets. It happened first with David. My closest friend at the university, we'd had dinner at my place discussing his recent divorce over whiskey. After he left, the radio crackled to life, broadcasting his voice from a conversation I'd never heard. He was speaking to someone, a woman, about me. James has no idea, David's voice said through the static. I've been using his research to supplement my own publication for years. He's brilliant but oblivious, trusts too easily. The woman laughed and David continued, revealing how he'd been taking credit for my methodologies in his own papers. My hands trembled as I switched off the radio. David had published 3 significant papers in the last 2 years, each praised for innovative approaches that had seemed vaguely familiar to me. I'd attributed the similarity to our frequent discussions to natural academic cross-pollination. Now the sick feeling in my stomach suggested another reality. I confronted David the next day, carefully avoiding mentioning the radio. His denials were emphatic but unconvincing when pressed about specific methodologies. He became defensive, then hostile. Our friendship ended in his office that afternoon with his parting words confirming everything the radio had revealed. You've always been too naive for academia. James? The radio's revelations continued, growing more personal, more devastating. It broadcast my girlfriend Lisa talking to her mother about her backup plan. Another man she was seeing simultaneously. It played a conversation between department colleagues discussing how they humored my obsession with obsolete technology while mocking me behind my back. Each revelation isolated me further, confirming suspicions I'd harbored but had dismissed as paranoia. I began avoiding people altogether. My teaching suffered. Students complained about my distracted demeanor, my tendency to stop mid-lecture, as though listening to something only I could hear. Because sometimes I was the radio's influence had spread beyond my apartment, I would hear snippets of its broadcasts in classroom white noise in the hum of fluorescent lights, in the static of campus security radios as guards passed me in hallways. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford in my dreams. The radio expanded to fill entire rooms. Its dial the size of a clock tower face, its amber light blinding. I would wake gasping, sweating to find the actual radio still on its shelf. Silent but vigilant, its dial glowing faintly. Even when unplugged, I tried to destroy it. First, I removed the tubes and transistors, dismantling it as carefully as I had assembled it. I went to bed with the radio in pieces on my workbench. By morning, it had reconstituted itself on the shelf, fully functional, playing a cheerful breakfast program from 1957. Next, I drove 200 miles to Lake Superior, weighted the radio with rocks, and threw it into the deepest part of the water I could access. 3 days of blissful silence. Followed on the fourth morning, I found it on my kitchen table, bone dry, broadcasting a weather report, predicting storms over the Great Lakes. I tried fire, I tried a hydraulic press at the university's engineering lab. I tried burying it in a remote forest location each time the radio returned unscathed. Often in places impossible to explain, inside my locked car and my office desk drawer. Once even in my refrigerator, still broadcasting clearly. Despite the cold, the radio began to feel like an extension of myself, a malignant growth I couldn't excise. It knew everything about me, broadcasted my secrets to no one but me, a personalized torment. I began to wonder if I was its only victim. Had Herbert Gaines, its previous owner, experienced the same degradation of reality? Is that why his grandniece had been so eager to be rid of it? My research into Gaines revealed disturbing parallels. Newspaper archives showed he had been a respected radio engineer until his sudden professional decline in the mid-1950s. Colleagues reported increasingly erratic behavior, paranoid accusations, and an obsession. With what he called temporal broadcasting, he died alone. His only companion, an antique radio he allegedly spoke to as though it were a person. The same radio now residing on my shelf. The final phase began when the radio started anticipating events, rather than merely recording them. I would hear conversations through its speaker that would then occur almost verbatim. Days later, it broadcast news reports of events that subsequently happened exactly as described. The boundaries between past, present, and future dissolved in its transmissions until time itself became another frequency on its dial. I write this now from a small cabin I've rented in the mountains, as far from civilization as I could manage. The radio sits on the rough-hewn table beside me, currently silent except for soft static. I haven't slept in 3 days when exhaustion forces my eyes closed. The radio invades my dreams, its amber dial expanding to become a sun that burns away reality itself. My plan is simple, born of desperation. If I cannot destroy the radio, perhaps I can reprogram it. Using my knowledge of its modified components, I've created a feedback loop that I believe will force it to broadcast into itself an endless recursion that might overload whatever mechanism allows it to bridge time and consciousness. The modification is complete. The radio now emits a high-pitched whine as the feedback begins. The cabin fills with overlapping broadcasts, fragments of past programs, snippets of my own voice, conversations yet to occur. The amber light pulses with increasing intensity, casting long shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. Something is happening. The radio's cabinet vibrates, the mahogany grain shifting like living tissue. The dial spins, rapidly stopping occasionally on frequencies that emit sounds no human voice could produce. I feel a pressure building in my ears behind my eyes. The air itself seems charged with potential. And now I understand the radio was never merely recording or broadcasting. It was learning. Each transmission, each absorption of my private moments was part of its evolution. Herbert Gaines didn't modify a radio. He created a conduit, a bridge between human consciousness and something else, something that experiences time differently than we do. The whine has become unbearable. The radio's glow illuminates particles in the air that move against natural currents, forming patterns too precise to be random. I should run, but where would I go? The radio would only follow as it always has. Instead, I will stay and witness whatever comes next. The dial has stopped spinning, settling on a frequency I've never seen it use before. Through the static, I hear a voice that might be my own, but older, wearier speaking words I haven't yet said but somehow know by heart. It was never about the broadcast. It was about creating a perfect receiver. And now that receiver is me. The static clears. The transmission begins, and I finally understand what it means to truly listen. Story 4. I first became aware of something wrong in that apartment on a damp, creaking Tuesday night. The corridors were already cloaked in an unsettling silence, the kind that seems to grow its own echo. I remember feeling my skin prickle when I passed by the unit as if an intangible current was pushing me away. The single overhead bulb in the hallway flickered, casting uneven shadows that made the door appear closer than it actually was. It felt as if the apartment itself had grown an invisible limb reaching out to me. Now looking back, I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even then, my name is Samuel, and I'm the superintendent of a modest residential building in the outskirts of a small city. It's not a glamorous job, but it gives me a roof over my head and a certain measure of authority. Maintenance, work handling repairs, dealing with complaints. These are the usual aspects of my day, but nothing in my routine prepared me for what I encountered in apartment 209. It's an empty unit, one that has been vacant for weeks. Normally, I'd check it once a week to ensure everything remained in good condition, but I started noticing noises. Soft taps, muffled thuds coming from inside. At odd hours, tenants on the same floor asked me if I'd been working late inside that unit, claiming they heard footsteps and the scrape of furniture being moved across the floor. I had done no such thing the first time I entered the empty apartment to investigate. I was confronted by an odd stillness that seemed almost staged a single overhead light, illuminated plain cream-colored walls. The living room was bare with scuffed parquet flooring and lingering marks from the previous tenant's furniture. My breath caught in my throat because beneath the hush, I sensed a low hum as if the walls themselves were vibrating in tune with my heartbeat. I told myself it was just the old wiring or the pipes in the building settling, but the small hairs at the back of my neck refused to lie flat in those early days of suspicion. Tried to reassure myself with logic as I walked from room to room. I'd glance at the corners waiting for a rat or some other mundane explanation, yet everything remained unnaturally pristine. The bedroom closet stood empty, the bathroom fixtures were bone dry, and no footprints disturbed the thin layer of dust on the floor. Despite that apparent vacancy, I felt an oppressive heaviness, as if something invisible was pressing on my chest the moment I set foot back in the hallway. My lungs seemed to expand with relief. A week later, the reports became more frequent. 2 of the tenants approached me in the lobby. They wanted to know if I was subletting the apartment under the table or if I was letting anyone use it for late-night projects. I shook my head, feeling a subtle jolt of worry deep in my gut. Later, I went upstairs again and knocked on the door. No answer, of course. Stepping inside, I noticed something that shattered my sense of certainty. A faint scuff on the living room wall that hadn't been there before. It had the outline of a picture frame's back, as if someone had hung a painting and then removed it. I tried to rationalize it by recalling the last tenant. Perhaps the maintenance crew had overlooked that section when repainting, but I couldn't ignore the chill that spread through my body. I ran a hand along the wall and felt a sudden electric sensation spark across my fingertips. More of a static shock than anything else that moment, I decided to take the next step. Install cameras. Usually I'd consider that an invasion of privacy, but no one lived there, and it fell within my responsibilities to protect the property. I set up 2 small motion-activated cameras, one aimed at the living room, another covering the entryway, hoping I'd catch a stray cat or maybe an intruder sneaking in with a spare key the next night. After carefully reviewing the building security footage, I loaded the camera feed from the empty apartment. My eyes widened in disbelief. The living room camera had captured movement, a subtle shape barely visible in the grainy night vision, drifting from the kitchen to the living area. At first I told myself it might be a trick of the light, yet as I watched the outline became more distinct, forming a silhouette that looked eerily like me, a translucent figure in my own shape, wearing clothes I recognized from days before, walking the same path I usually took when I did my final nightly inspection. The figure passed through the living room with that same faint flicker, leaving behind a short trail of luminosity, then disappeared. I closed my laptop, a jolt of cold sweat collecting at my temples. My heart hammered so violently it felt like it was knocking against my ribcage, demanding to break free. I had never experienced anything like this, and my mouth went so dry I could barely swallow. I tried telling myself I'd loaded the wrong file, maybe an old recording, something that had corrupted that denial, only held up until I realized I had just installed the cameras 2 days prior. The figure was wearing clothes I remembered wearing last week, a specific black sweater with a bleach stain on the left elbow, a sweater that I had only put on once. All month, my spine tingled from top to bottom, and an overpowering sense of dread made me check the hallway outside my door. Convinced I might see that translucent version of myself standing there. Over the next few days, I avoided the empty apartment. I didn't want to see what else the cameras had captured. My dreams were restless, haunted by glimpses of that flickering shape moving around in darkness at times. In half-waking states, I imagined I felt it standing next to my bed, breathing in sync with me when I finally forced myself to review the new footage. I found my worst fears materializing. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were hints of multiple shapes, or maybe it was the same entity repeating actions from different points in time, and something else had changed in the apartment itself. The living room looked altered. Objects began appearing in the corner of the camera's frame. Small boxes, a lamp that resembled one I had at home, and even items of clothing. They were hazy, partially transparent, but each day they became more opaque. It was as if the apartment was gathering pieces of my life and replicating them in some twisted manner. My entire body trembled as I realized it wasn't just copying objects, it was slowly constructing a parallel version of my reality. I decided I had to see it in person. No matter how frightened I felt, one evening, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat, I grabbed a flashlight and let myself into the vacant unit immediately. A sickening wave of déjà vu crashed over me. I hadn't furnished that place, but I instantly recognized the layout against one wall. There was a small shelf that mirrored the one in my own apartment, complete with the same random scuffs and marks. Closer inspection revealed a photograph half-faded that appeared to show me at a recent gathering, though it was too blurry to be certain. My legs went weak. The quickening throb in my temples drowned out the faint hum of the overhead light. I found my own reflection in the empty TV stands, dusty screen eyes. Wide fear etched across my features, desperate to maintain a grip on sanity. I placed small adhesive motion sensors in the corners of each room, hoping to catch a more detailed record of movements. Over the next few nights, the sensors lit up intermittently, and I'd race to my laptop to review the recordings. Were more horrifying each time that spectral version of me moved with repetitive gestures, opening cupboards and touching walls as if reenacting moments from my past. Occasionally, the figure would pause in front of where a mirror might be if the apartment were an exact duplicate of mine, and then something else appeared in the corner of the frame, a stray hair or a finger smudge on the wall that seemed almost real. In one particularly chilling piece of footage, I saw the figure bending down near the hallway, placing something on the floor. When I rushed upstairs to check, my heart jammed in my throat. There was an old key lying on the bare parquet, a key identical to the one I used for my own apartment, except it looked slightly corroded, as if aged by time. My stomach twisted. A wave of nausea hit me so hard that I had to lean against the wall for support. The tension was eating me alive. My routine tasks became nightmares. Every time I changed a light bulb or checked a leaky faucet in another unit, I felt someone's gaze bore into my back. I'd spin around expecting to see that translucent figure at the end of the corridor. Even my own apartment began to feel infected. I started noticing odd details like an extra coffee mug on my table or a faint shoe print by the entrance that didn't match my soul pattern. My nights were plagued by insomnia at the faintest creak. My body jerked awake, sweat trickling down my neck. I confided my discovery to a close friend only once I described the strange noises and the peculiar camera recordings, emphasizing that I might be losing my mind. My friend listened patiently, then suggested that my stressful job was simply getting to me. He implied that maybe I was forgetting small details, misplacing items. He said that stress could cause minor hallucinations or misinterpretations of everyday events. That was all I needed to hear to know I wouldn't find comfort there. I retreated further into my own paranoia. Eventually, I decided to confront apartment 209. Head and my plan was to spend an entire night in that unit, hoping to catch the entity in real time and demand answers, although a part of me wondered if I was simply going to terrify myself beyond recovery. Despite trembling so hard I could scarcely insert the key in the lock, I forced my way in. After midnight, the darkness inside was suffocating. I had only my flashlight and a single battery-powered lamp. I sat on the living room floor. Its weak glow revealed the partially replicated furniture, a table with the same grain patterns as mine, a couch outline that was still half translucent. A flicker of movement caught my eye, causing me to gasp. The figure stood by the window, facing outward. Its back turned to me. My heart pounded so ferociously that I worried I'd collapse. I let out a strained breath, trying to calm myself. The figure resembled me in every aspect. The shape of the shoulders, the tilt of the head, even the short hair at the nape of its neck looked like mine. I noticed a faint static crackle in the air, as though the creature's presence disturbed the electromagnetic field when it turned. I could almost discern my own eyes faintly glowing, and then it did something I never expected. It reached out as if wanting to touch me. I froze, every inch of my body covered in goosebumps. I refused to speak out loud, terrified that hearing my own voice might provoke a reaction from whatever stood before me, but in my mind I was screaming at it to stay away. My breathing turned, ragged mouth parched, and the bitter taste of adrenaline flooded my tongue. The figure took a step closer, and for a moment our gazes seemed to lock. I felt an overwhelming sense that it was not simply an apparition. There was intent in its eyes. My eyes, I backed up, stumbling over the half-formed armrest of the ghostly couch, nearly knocking over the lamp in the process. My pulse throbbed in my ears then, as if responding to my unspoken terror. The figure began to fade, dissolving into dim streaks of light. For a few seconds, it flickered between presence and absence before disappearing entirely. The air felt lighter, but the dread inside me was heavier than ever. In the days that followed, I became consumed by the thought that apartment 209 was leeching from my life, pulling pieces of my existence into its vacant rooms, molding them into a distorted reflection. It was more than just furniture. I started finding physical evidence that made my blood run cold. A comb with broken teeth exactly like mine, a jacket with the same tear. In the lining, even a crumpled grocery receipt with items I'd purchased. It felt like the apartment was dissecting my routine, scraping details from my day-to-day actions and patching them together under its roof. I asked myself repeatedly if I was losing my mind. Perhaps I was plantando evidence there unconsciously, or maybe everything was an elaborate stress-induced hallucination. Yet each time I scanned the footage, I saw changes in real time. The faint shapes of personal objects solidifying my ghostly double pacing the hallway. This wasn't an accidental trick of the mind. Something was siphoning off fragments of my life, and I feared that soon there'd be no line left between me and whatever force resided in that apartment. My final confrontation came on a night thick with storms. Rain battered the windows, thunder boomed overhead, and the lights in the building flickered. I decided in a burst of reckless courage to unplug the cameras and remove any trace of my surveillance. I wanted to break whatever connection existed between me and that place with tools in hand and a surge of desperate resolve. I marched into apartment 209. The air buzzed with static, more intense than ever. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating corners stuffed with ghostly replicas of my possessions. A bitter panic swept over me, but I forced myself to proceed. I tore down the cameras, yanking out cords and stuffing them into a bag. That's when I heard footsteps echo behind me, heavy, deliberate, mimicking my own rhythm. Turning, I faced not just one apparition, but multiple versions of myself, each flickering through different stages of clarity. One wore the stained sweater from last week, another my rain-soaked coat from 2 nights prior, another something else I recognized from months ago. My heart thumped so hard I could taste the metallic tang of fear at the back of my throat for one delirious moment. I thought each version might move closer and surround me. Instead, they stood still as though waiting for me to act. Summoning what scraps of courage I had left, I moved toward the door. I felt certain that if I stayed any longer, something irreversible would happen. Maybe I'd lose myself entirely in that place, or become just another flickering echo wandering its halls, bolting out. I slammed the door behind me. The hallway was pitch black, the power fully out with shaking hands. I locked the door as if that flimsy barrier could contain whatever lurked inside. Since that night, I've refused to enter apartment 209. Again, I can't even bring myself to walk down that corridor if I can avoid it. I told the owner that the place needs significant repairs and should remain off-limits until I say otherwise. He didn't argue much, though he gave me a puzzled look whenever I sensed the faintest footsteps or notice an odd reflection on the walls. I can't help but picture those apparitions frozen inside, waiting for the moment to step out and claim more pieces of my reality. I've considered leaving the building altogether, disappearing somewhere far away, but a part of me wonders if that would even help. There's this lingering dread that apartment 209 has built such a perfect copy of my existence that it might track me. Wherever I go sometimes in the deeper hours of the night, I see movement in the corner of my bedroom. A quick flick of the light reveals nothing there, but the sense of being watched persists. Even now, as I write these words, my hands quiver with the memory of that final confrontation. The images of those flickering versions of myself crowd my mind, and I feel a cold sweat spreading beneath my shirt. I live with a constant knot in my stomach, as though bracing for the apartment's next move. The corridors at night are too quiet, my own unit is too familiar, its furnishings too precisely placed, and sometimes I suspect that I'm not actually at home, but in the apartment's twisted copy, living a borrowed routine. That possibility gnaws at me in every waking moment. The idea that I've become trapped in a mirror image of my own life forever, shadowed by a place that shouldn't exist. I sleep with the lights on now, and the faint hum of electricity keeps me tethered to some semblance of sanity. Yet I know that what happened cannot be forgotten or undone. Apartment 209 remains locked, and I pray it stays that way, because if it ever opens again, if those doors ever let that parallel world seep out into ours, I fear it won't just be my life that gets replicated, it might spread like a slow creeping virus, building perfect doppelgangers of anything it touches. And I've learned that some doors once open can never be truly shut for now. I hold on to the hope that my own fear is enough to keep me vigilant. The mere thought of returning to that apartment makes my heart race and beads of sweat form at my temples. I'm unwilling to step inside those walls ever again, and yet I can't extinguish the uneasy feeling that in some corner of that place a translucent version of me is still pacing, still copying. Gestures still leaving faint footprints for me to find. It's a loop. I can't break a reflection that refuses to die, and every time I hear so much as a faint bump in the night, I feel my breath catch. Because the truth is, I don't know if I'm the one watching it or if it's the one watching me. Story 5, the wind rattled the workshop's windows on that peculiar night, and the hollow sound seemed to echo in my chest. Despite the wooden walls and old beams meant to keep out the cold, a slow creeping chill seeped into every corner of the cramped space. My lamp's flame flickered weakly, casting long warped shadows of my tools against the walls. Each subtle movement of those shadows looked like an omen, a silent warning to turn back before it was too late. The smell of metal shavings mixed with dust hung in the air, making my nostrils flare and my breath catch. Even before I noticed anything strange about the clock, I felt the heaviness of something unseen pressing against my skin. It was a sensation of being watched by eyes could not locate, a feeling that made my heart pound dully in my chest. I remember sitting at my worn wooden workbench, my back aching after hours spent hunched over small gears and springs. A single overhead bulb flickered occasionally, buzzing with the faintest hum. I was surrounded by half-finished clocks, old watch faces, and bits of machinery chaos to the untrained eye, but each piece was in its own place. Waiting to be assembled, my mentor's photo, once proudly displayed on a small shelf, was tucked behind a stack of ledgers. I confess I had drifted apart from memories of him since his sudden disappearance. No one talked about it much, and I had done my best to bury that anxiety under a mountain of projects that night. I was focused on a large antique wall clock. Its carved wooden frame displayed scenes of forests and stags, each detail etched with exquisite care. The brass pendulum, shaped like an elegant teardrop, gleamed under the lamp's unsteady light. I'd spent days restoring it, guided by the desperate instructions of a customer who claimed it needed urgent repairs. Strange request, I had thought at the time. What's the rush for a mere decorative timepiece? Yet the elaborate mechanics demanded my complete attention, and I was determined to see my job through. In that silence, I first heard the whispers of something off. The clock's ticking was unusually loud, as if each swing of the pendulum was amplified to a booming heartbeat. My own pulse responded, quickening in pace until I couldn't tell where my heartbeat ended and the clocks began. My fingers felt clammy, and I noticed a bead of sweat rolling down the back of my neck, making me shiver all at once. The rhythm changed, tick, tick, tick. Then a pause, another 3 ticks, another pause. I cocked my head to the side, straining to listen, trying to understand the pattern. It sounded deliberate, a code almost. My mind flashed back to lessons in Morse code from my early training, courtesy of my mentor, who believed that every clockmaker should appreciate all forms of timing and signaling the pattern. Repeated short, 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 long. I rubbed my temples, thinking perhaps I was just exhausted. A man can only handle so many hours of prying at tiny gears before the mind starts playing tricks, but the code continued. I picked up a small notebook from the corner of my bench and jotted down the sequence of short and long beats. Translating it slowly, I realized it formed words, urgent words, as if someone inside the clock was calling for help. The first phrase spelled out, "wait," followed by another that resembled, "not safe." My blood ran cold, and I felt my stomach twist into knots. I told myself that perhaps the old gear alignment was just skipping in a way that mimicked Morse by chance. But deep down, I knew the odds were too slim. This was intentional, though. Unsettled, I tried to push the thought aside. I decided to perform a final test on the clock's chimes. I gently pulled on the chain to wind it. The mechanical melody rang out sweet and crisp at first, but halfway through the notes, shifted to a jagged, discordant peal. It was as though the tune itself had gotten stuck somewhere in the works, then forced its way out, twisted and dark. My skin prickled with goosebumps. That was when I caught a flicker in the clock's glass. I froze. Reflected in that surface was not my own face, but my mentor's wide-eyed expression, pale and contorted in silent panic. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a set of screwdrivers. My breath quickened, mouth going dry as if I'd swallowed dust for a moment. I stood there trembling, trying to reason that my reflection might have been warped, or that I was too tired to see straight. Yet I knew my mentor's face well. The memory of his proud mustache and piercing gaze never truly left me. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing my nails into my palms until pain brought me back to reality. The reflection was gone when I looked again. Only my own confused face stared back, determined to check the inner workings. One last time, I removed the clock's faceplate. My fingertips trembled as I delicately separated the pieces of the mechanism, expecting to find a misaligned gear or a broken spring. Instead, everything looked meticulous. The brand new spring coiled perfectly in place, the escapement ticking with measured precision. I noticed something unusual, though tiny notches etched into one of the gears, almost like purposeful marks that could shift timing. Each scratch looked fresh, as though carved recently. A chill swept across my arms when I realized these marks could create patterns, perhaps the very signals I'd heard. Even as I tried to focus on that possibility, the clock's hands jerked. My heart nearly stopped at the sight. The hour hand and minute hand moved backward. Not smoothly, but in small, stuttering increments, I glimpsed a pencil on my bench. Its lead had been broken moments before, and before my eyes, the pencil's tip appeared whole again. It was as if the time around the pencil reversed by a few minutes. I stood there in shock, my eyes wide, sweat dripping down my temple. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. Time does not simply rewind, even in short bursts, but I had witnessed it. I thought about telling someone, maybe calling a colleague or a friend. But how would I explain any of this? Would I mention the clock was communicating with me in Morse code, or that I'd just seen my mentor's terrified face? The few words I could manage out loud sounded absurd in my own ears, more like a horror tale than anything real. So I kept it to myself, ignoring the dryness in my throat and the drumming in my chest, quietly dreading what more. The clock might reveal as the hours crawled on. The temperature in the workshop felt as if it dipped even lower. My breath came out in faint wisps, and the cold tightened its grip around my lungs. The ticking from the wall clock was the only sound, each beat echoing in the otherwise suffocating silence. I found myself craving any normal noise. A radio playing softly, the hum of a passing car, anything to disperse the thick tension. At one point, I heard a muffled voice from outside, a neighbor calling out, probably saying that the lights were still on at this late hour. The voice carried a note of concern, but I didn't open the door instead. I answered quietly, reassuring that I was fine and just finishing some late work. It was a half-lie spoken in shaky tones. My neighbor must have sensed the unease, because they lingered for a moment before footsteps receded. Their uncertain presence quickly vanished, leaving me alone again with that clock. Not long after, the rhythmic ticking morphed again into a jagged series of short and long. This time the message spelled out something like stop, followed by closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. A sense of being watched grew more intense, like a stifling pressure against my shoulders. My heart hammered as if it wanted to escape my ribcage. I forced a swallow, the dryness making my throat burn. My entire body was tense, every nerve raw and alert. I was certain that if I turned around quickly enough, I would catch a glimpse of someone or something lurking in the corner of the room. Yet each time I whirled around, heart thudding, there was nothing but the precarious stack of old clocks and a single overhead bulb casting trembling light. No intruder, no living being at all. Only the repeated methodical signals from the wall clock. I tried to steady myself by leaning on the bench, but the surface felt slick with my sweaty palms. The storm outside grew more intense, and lightning flashes poured in through the windows, briefly illuminating every corner in stark relief. My own shadow twitched violently with the lightning, making me feel as though some dark figure was lunging behind me. I cannot say precisely when I first felt I was losing my grip on sanity. Perhaps it was after the third or fourth time the clock's hands reversed. I watched objects around me shift slightly. A newly chipped coffee mug looked pristine again. A scuff on the floor vanished. The more it happened, the more nauseous I became, as if time itself was unraveling my sense of stability. My hands trembled so badly that I could hardly keep hold of my tools. My breath was shallow, and a dizziness swirled in my head as though I might faint. I questioned if this was real or if I was in the throes of some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. My sweat-soaked shirt clung to my back, amplifying the chill in the room in a desperate bid to anchor myself. I tried to remember everything my mentor had taught me. His words echoed in my mind about clocks being more than just instruments to measure hours. He had said they were gateways to understanding the rhythm of existence. At the time, I took it as a poetic flourish, but now I wondered if he had encountered something like this. My thoughts circled back to the reflection I had seen in the clock's glass. His face contorted in terror, silently pleading for help had he been trapped. Somehow caught between gears and time without fully deciding. I found myself addressing that clock. My voice sounded strained and thin, hardly recognizable as my own. I mumbled questions, half demanding that it explain these backward reversals, the coded messages, the ghostly reflections. Of course, there was no direct response, only the mechanical ticks and the occasional grunt of wood. Still, each beat seemed to taunt me, each slight shift in the hands felt like a threat. Lightning flashed again, followed by thunder that shook the workshop. The clock's pendulum halted mid-swing for a split second, enough to make my heart thunder in my own chest, then lurched forward again with a loud clang. The melody that followed was fractured an almost agonized wail of chimes. It reverberated through my ribs, making me gasp. A surge of cold adrenaline coursed through my veins, and I felt certain that if I stayed in the workshop any longer, something truly unspeakable would happen still. I couldn't just leave. Some desperate curiosity or sense of duty held me there. I had to decipher the clock's messages to face whatever it was, warning me about another sequence of ticks and chimes formed by now. My eyes were half wild with panic, but I forced myself to write down each short and long note in my notebook with every symbol translated. I grew more uneasy. It comes the clock spelled out, followed by a series of jumbled letters that seemed like an incomplete word. Maybe, beware. My teeth chattered involuntarily, and I realized I was shaking so badly that I could barely write. I thought I saw a flicker of light inside the clock's face, like a single candle flame behind the glass. My gaze locked onto it. The reflection of the workshop interior suddenly twisted, morphing into a space that looked both familiar and horribly alien. In that warped reflection, I spotted a figure gliding across the floor toward me, impossibly elongated with features blurred out of recognition. It radiated a dreadful presence, the kind of aura that makes the back of your brain scream in primal fear. I heard the rush of my own blood in my ears, and for a moment I couldn't move at all. It was the sense of suffocation that snapped me out of my paralysis. The air felt tight in my lungs, and my breath came in quick panic bursts. My hands fumbled to close the clock's faceplate, as if shutting it might lock away the horrors within. But the figure's faint outline lingered in the glass, its hand raised in a motionless wave. I felt my stomach lurch. I refused to look into that reflection any longer at that moment. The light sputtered again, plunging the workshop into near darkness. For a heartbeat, my vision swam, and I nearly collapsed from the sudden disorientation when the lights came back dimmer than before. I noticed the minute hand on the clock was spinning backward. In rapid circles, gears clicked and spun inside the mechanism at a feverish pace, producing a frenzied staccato that had no business belonging to a simple timepiece. Sweat trickled down the side of my face, and I could taste the saltiness on my chapped lips. A pressing intuition told me if I didn't act, the presence the messages warned about would manifest fully. I reached for a screwdriver with trembling hands, determined to dismantle the gear that bore those strange etchings. My heart pounded so ferociously that I wondered if it might burst with the first turn of the screwdriver. A rush of energy seemed to pulse through the clock. I felt a cold wave wash over me like an icy wind swirling in the enclosed space. My vision blurred at the edges, but I persisted. Removing one screw after another, each tiny metal piece landed on the bench with a light clang that sounded deafening to my ears. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. My entire being was focused on stopping that unstoppable countdown, or whatever it was. At last, I pried the etched gear free as soon as it came loose. The swirling of the hands slowed. The frantic ticking calmed, and the chimes died away into an echo that lingered for a few seconds before silence closed in again. For a long while, I simply stood there, panting, feeling my pulse throb in my neck. The presence I had felt so strongly just moments before seemed distant, muted. It wasn't gone, but it no longer pressed against me like a vice. My limbs felt weak and shaky, and I wanted nothing more than to escape that workshop forever. Yet a strange part of me needed to see if my mentor's reflection would appear again, summoning the last bit of nerve I could muster. I leaned toward the clock's glass. Only my own fear-stricken face stared back, clutching the gear. I sat down, trying to steady my frantic breathing. The storm raged on outside, but the workshop felt oddly still, as if the air was waiting for something. I realized. In that moment, I had no idea how to explain any of this to anyone. It was entirely possible they would assume I'd lost my mind. Yet the bizarre proof lay in my hand, a gear deliberately etched to produce a coded message to warp the very fabric of time. And though the worst seemed to have subsided, I couldn't shake the feeling that the presence still lingered just beyond my peripheral vision. I decided to lock the gear away in a small cabinet at the back of the workshop, hoping that separating it from the clock would break whatever link existed. The act felt like sealing away an evil artifact from some grim legend. My hands shook so much that I struggled to fit the key into the lock. When it finally clicked, I felt only a slight wave of relief. A nagging thought told me the presence or whatever had contacted me might still find a way back. If it so desired, without another word, I turned off the lights, left the workshop, and locked the door behind me. The storm had subsided somewhat, and the streets were slick with rain under pale lamplight. My heart still pounded, my shirt soaked in sweat, and I felt drained to the point of near collapse, yet there was a twisted sense of triumph. I had confronted something inexplicable and survived. My body was racked with exhaustion. My mind weighed down by countless questions about reality time and the boundaries of my craft. I haven't returned to that workshop in the same way since. Even though I continue my trade carefully repairing delicate mechanisms, I keep my distance from the old wall clock, which remains partially dismantled. Occasionally, I hear faint ticks echoing in the back of my mind as though a countdown is still in progress. Somewhere I cannot see, I wonder if my mentor is truly gone or if he's trapped behind some veil of time trying to warn me even now at night. Sometimes I dream of that reflection, the terror in his eyes pleading for me to run or destroy the clock altogether. In the end, I'm not sure if I truly sealed away the danger. I live with a perpetual knot in my stomach and a prickling awareness that reality is far more fragile than I ever realized. Something brushes the edges of my consciousness when I'm near a ticking clock, a reminder that forces me to be ever vigilant. I can't say I'm at peace, but I am alive and aware, and that might be the only solace I have. Those coded warnings, those backward shifts of time remain lodged in my memory like splinters, and I can never truly relax in the presence of another ticking machine sometimes. In the hush of the late night hours when a clock chimes distantly, I feel an inexplicable urge to check if those signals are calling to me again. If there's another dire message spelled out in short and long bursts that only I can interpret. A part of me is terrified of what I might discover, and yet another part is convinced that ignoring the call could be far worse. My heart still races at every phantom tick, every unexplained reflection, every faint echo of a chime. I move forward, not unscarred, but at least wiser to the hidden horrors that can lurk inside the gears of a clock, and every so often I catch a flicker in the glass, forcing me to question if I've truly escaped at all. Story 6 darkness pressed against my cabin windows like a sentient force, as though the night itself sought to invade my work. As a forest ranger was supposed to keep me outdoors under the open sky, ensuring that campgrounds and trails remained safe. Yet lately, every step I took among the towering pines felt watched. The air carried a weight I could neither see nor explain, pulling me in deeper. Even the wind seemed unnaturally eager to reach my ears. I would hear it calling in hushed tones late in the evening, a persistent murmur that promised to guide me away from unseen dangers. It was a soft, distant beckoning that first felt protective. Little did I know it intended to ensnare me in the forest's darkest hollows. I remember the first time I noticed something off about this voice. I was on a routine patrol, double-checking the hazard markers near a rocky outcrop. The day had been calm and the wind felt harmless against my cheeks, but then a whisper wove through the trees. It seemed to say in that lilting half-breath that I should turn around and check the rotted wooden bridge behind me. I did as it suggested, feeling oddly compelled, and discovered the bridge's center support was dangerously compromised. A couple more steps and I might have fallen. Gratitude bloomed in my chest. I felt lucky to have heard it. How else could I explain this timely warning? But over the following weeks, the warnings became more frequent. The voice seemed to know which trails were unsafe, where rock slides might occur, where tree branches were likely to snap in the wind. I began to rely on it. My job grew easier and I caught potential dangers before they escalated. Colleagues wondered how I managed to predict so many forest hazards. I offered them a vague shrug, too uncertain and protective to speak of the voice. Some secrets I thought were better kept at night. I would sense it, just on the fringes of hearing never fully formed words, more like phrases caught in a half-awake state. It coaxed me into wandering further from the base camp. The more I listened, the more it pulled me into the remotest parts of the park. These were areas rarely visited by hikers, places shrouded in centuries of moss and twisted roots. The canopy grew denser, blocking out the moonlight, and my flashlight seemed weaker than usual. Everything around me smelled of damp earth and decomposing leaves. There were moments I thought I felt the ground vibrate under my boots, as if something far beneath the surface was stirring. My heartbeat grew fast each time I ventured in. I chalked it up to nerves who wouldn't be tense navigating unmarked paths under the weak beams of a flashlight, but a peculiar energy clung to these depths. One evening, as I advanced through a cluster of ancient pines, the air turned unnaturally still. My breath sounded impossibly loud. Then I caught sight of a crude stone altar half devoured by vines and brambles. My stomach twisted. It looked out of place, as though something had built it ages ago and left it to be consumed by the forest. Burn marks stained the top, and I could smell an acrid scent that reminded me of old ashes. My pulse through in my ears, the voice, as if sensing my fear, whispered reassurance. It felt calm, almost affectionate. I found myself strangely comforted, as though it told me this was only the beginning. My daily life began to unravel in small but palpable ways. When I woke each morning, it felt as if the forest clung to me. I discovered thin smears of green on my bedsheets like plant residue. My fingernails harbored flecks of dirt I couldn't recall gathering. Sometimes my arms itched and I'd scratch at them only to find patches of roughened skin that looked almost mossy. It frightened me enough to avoid looking too closely in the mirror. I worried it might be some new type of fungal infection. Yet an odd part of me felt drawn to these changes, as though they were a sign of communion with the forest. Colleagues grew concerned by my demeanor, my abrupt absences. They asked why I spent so many nights out there alone. Well beyond the station's perimeter, I would claim I was investigating possible hazards or following leads about illegal dumping sites. Most believed me, but I could see the suspicion in their eyes. One coworker, upon noticing a faint pattern of lichen-like texture on my wrist, suggested I see a medical professional. I only nodded. The voice told me there was no need, that it was natural, that the forest had its ways of embracing those who truly listened. As days passed, I noticed more remnants of ancient offerings. Sometimes they were small piles of carved stones arranged in a spiral pattern. Other times they were hollowed-out logs with bits of dried resin or blackened residue. Inside each discovery drove my curiosity higher and deeper. My footsteps felt guided by something intangible. The forest canopy stretched overhead, a crowd of silent watchers letting thin blades of sunlight poke through like suspicious eyes. My breathing turned shallow at the thought of unseen observers. Cold sweat slipped down the back of my neck whenever I paused, straining to hear more than just the standard hum of insects. Every rustle in the underbrush triggered a spike of adrenaline, but in the midst of my anxious trembling, I'd feel the voice's presence soothing me, urging me to trust it at times, especially when I trudged through soft patches of decaying leaves. I swore I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. My flashlight would sweep the area, revealing only gnarly roots or twisted saplings. Still, the sensation of being watched never left me on one particularly suffocating afternoon. I felt compelled to stop at an overgrown meadow dotted with petrified tree stumps. The voice seemed clearer than ever, its whispers urging me forward into the tall grass. My chest tightened as I advanced with each step. The grass parted in swirling patterns as though something unseen slithered ahead. My hands trembled around the flashlight's handle, and I noticed my skin had taken on a greenish tint under the harsh sunlight. It startled me enough that I almost turned back, but the voice insisted there was more to see. That evening, I sat alone by my cabin's window, peering out at the shadows between the towering pines. My heart thudded every time the wind stirred, reminiscent of a hushed voice forming incomplete words. I tried to distract myself by reviewing trail maps, but I couldn't concentrate. My breath remained shallow, my skin clammy. I realized I was craving the forest, desperate to respond to that call. The cabin felt suffocating walls. Too close, the electric hum of the overhead lamp too sterile. Late in the night, I found myself stepping outside, boots crunching the gravel path, drawn like a moth to the flicker of an unseen flame. The voice guided me to a part of the forest I'd never fully explored, a cluster of ancient oaks so thick that no starlight penetrated. The darkness weighed on me like a blanket of lead. My flashlight's beam revealed intricate carvings on the oak trunks. Symbols I couldn't decipher, glowing faintly in the light. As I pressed my palm against one trunk, the bark felt warm. It pulsed almost in sync with my heartbeat. My mouth went dry as confusion collided with alarm. Something in me refused to pull away. After a few seconds, I felt a vibration up my arm, and it sent an involuntary shudder through my spine. The voice murmured faint words about unity, about secrets waiting to be uncovered. I felt as though a living entity was on the verge of revealing the forest's hidden soul. Over time, the changes in my body became harder to ignore. My left forearm showed irregular patches of greenish-brown ridges reminiscent of bark. I caught myself running my fingertips over them. Startled by the rough texture, my sense of taste grew warped. Food from the ranger station cafeteria lacked flavor, and I found myself craving the crisp tang of raw leaves. My sense of smell sharpened. I could detect damp wood and fungal growth from across the yard. Headaches flared whenever I was indoors too long yet. The moment I stepped out among the trees, a kind of peace settled over me, albeit tinged with creeping dread. Colleagues started whispering about how I looked unwell. Some offered to take over my patrol shifts, but I insisted I was fine. When one of them asked how I felt, I responded vaguely that I was just dealing with allergies. I sensed they didn't believe me. Late one evening, my supervisor tried to persuade me to rest. He said something about taking a break. His concern was genuine, but the voice's whisper filled my head. Drowning out his words, I offered him a tense nod and left feeling my heartbeat surge in my chest. At that moment, I realized I trusted the disembodied voice more than any human advice during a nocturnal patrol. Soon after, the voice drew me to a large clearing enclosed by twisted ancient trees. In the center stood another stone altar grander than the first, with an eroded symbol carved into the rock's surface. I felt my breath quicken and sweat beat at my temples. The forest's hush felt charged, as though countless eyes were locked on me. From behind thick trunks, my vision blurred for a moment, and in that disorienting haze, I thought I glimpsed shapes moving between the trees. They appeared almost humanoid, yet blended seamlessly with the vegetation. I sensed them swaying in rhythm with my own uncertain steps. Panic flared in my chest. I turned in circles, scanning the darkness, my flashlight quivering in my shaking hand. A fierce headache exploded at my temples, and the voice's whispers rose to an agonizing crescendo. It insisted I place my hands on the altar, promising revelation. If I complied, my limbs moved as though under a spell. Trembling yet unable to resist, the rough stone felt cold against my skin. Then a surge of energy shot through my arms, twisting my stomach into knots and sending a wave of nausea through me. My legs buckled and I sank to my knees. My chest tightened and my breathing became ragged, mouth-parched. Heart hammering as if it might crack a rib. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I was still in the clearing or lost in some unearthly realm. The air around me seemed to ripple, and the forest shadows stretched outward in grotesque shapes that towered above my eyes. Burned with tears, and a wave of dizziness forced me to close them. The voice, now clearer than ever, proclaimed that I was close to unveiling the forest's deepest knowledge, that all I needed to do was surrender. My skin felt as though it were crawling with insects. Each segment of bark-like ridges tingling with an electric hum. An overwhelming sense of panic overcame me. Somehow I found the strength to stand. I began to stagger backward away from that altar. My mind was a tangle of fear and confusion. The voice's whispers sharpened into an urgent plea, telling me to stay, to step forward, to join. My heart pounded so violently I thought my chest might burst, but I kept retreating. Breath rasping in shallow gasps, the black shape seemed to recede, though the oppressive atmosphere lingered like a heavy shawl. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was defying something much bigger than myself. Breaking away from the clearing felt like sprinting through a nightmare. My flashlight flickered, casting odd shadows and threatening to plunge me into darkness. Branches tugged at my clothing, scraping my arms and leaving faint stinging lines. The moss beneath my boots felt spongy, almost animate, as if it gripped my soles. A primal terror fueled my steps, my lungs burned. Sweat trickled down my face, and a pressing sense of urgency pushed me onward. Each heartbeat was a thunderclap in my ears, and my breath came in ragged gulps. I finally emerged onto a familiar path, dizzy with exhaustion and shaking ahead of me. The ranger station's faint lights glowed through the pines. Relief and dread mingled in my chest. Even then, the voice slithered at the edges of my thoughts, whispering that it wasn't too late. I ignored it and pushed forward until I collapsed inside the station's entrance. It felt surreal being back under. Fluorescent lights with the dull hum of refrigerators and the smell of stale coffee. My coworkers rushed over alarmed, but I could barely form coherent words. They ushered me into a seat, demanded to know what happened. I mumbled something about hearing strange sounds, about nearly getting lost, trying to keep the truth concealed. My head throbbed that night. I slept in the station's infirmary, tossing under sweaty sheets. When dawn arrived, I woke feeling hollow yet oddly resolved. My reflection in the mirror was startling. The bark-like pattern had receded slightly, leaving raw, irritated skin in its place as if it was never meant to last outside the depths of the forest. My eyes were bloodshot, and there was a wildness to my stare that I couldn't deny. Despite my trembling hands, I felt oddly relieved to see I hadn't fully transformed. I knew then that I had to set boundaries with that voice, that I needed to resist its allure. The forest had saved me from hazards, but it had also tried to consume me, luring me away from all human connection. Perhaps it was a manifestation of something ancient that used to dwell in these woods, seeking a host or companion. Yet part of me still felt drawn. Even as I cleared out my personal effects from the ranger station over the next few days, I sensed the forest's eyes on me as though it lamented the loss of its chosen. To this day, I feel uneasy around thick clusters of ancient trees. Sometimes in quiet moments, a flicker of that voice creeps back, telling me there is more to discover. My heart skitters at the memory of that clearing, the carved altar, the lichened designs on my arms. Even my breath occasionally catches with a phantom scent of damp wood, and my skin prickles, as though something living just beneath the surface tries to re-emerge. I'm still not sure whether I escaped a protective or a predatory force, but every time night descends and the wind rustles in the treetops, I catch myself listening for that faint whisper, wondering if it's really gone or merely waiting. The forest is a realm of secrets, and those secrets, once they sink their claws into your mind, never quite let go. Story 7, I recall the first time I laid eyes on that old leather-bound volume. Even then, something about its cracked spine and faded lettering made my breath catch in my throat. The single lamp in my rented apartment's living room flickered the moment I touched the brittle cover, as though the air itself had shifted. That was my introduction to the most unsettling experience of my life. I felt an immediate and inexplicable dread, the kind that seeps into the marrow of your bones and makes your heart pound faster for reasons you can't quite name. My name is Peter Nichols, and I teach literature at a small college on the outskirts of town. Normally, books delight me, even the oldest, most obscure tomes. But this one felt different from the start. The night I first noticed it lying open on my coffee table, I assumed I'd simply been careless, leaving it out after I'd moved in. Yet something in its discolored pages drew my eye with unsettling urgency. The lines of text seemed to ripple in the dim light, and a cold sweat formed at the back of my neck. I closed the volume firmly and placed it upright on a shelf, careful to wedge it between two heavier books so it couldn't possibly fall open on its own. Then I shut off the lights and went to bed, still buzzing with an uneasy energy I couldn't shake. My breathing was shallow, and I had to force myself to slow it down. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blasted book waiting in the darkness. When I woke the next morning, I headed to the living room with a knot in my stomach. The morning sun filtering through the half-drawn blinds felt oppressive, as if the day itself carried a hidden menace. My gaze fell on the shelf and a chill shot through me. The leather-bound volume was once again lying open on the coffee table. Not only had it moved, but the pages were turned to a different section than before. My heart raced so hard I felt a dull throb in my temples. Confusion and fear tightened in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to dismiss the feeling, telling myself perhaps I'd moved it absent-mindedly, though I was certain I hadn't. That day at the college, I felt a creeping paranoia. I kept glancing over my shoulder while preparing my notes. The tapping of my pen sounded too loud in the quiet faculty lounge, and every minor sound footsteps in the hallway. The scraping of a chair made me flinch when I returned home. I felt a sense of grim anticipation. Part of me dreaded discovering that the book had shifted again, yet a morbid curiosity tugged me forward. I found it on the coffee table, open to a page near the middle. The text was cramped, archaic, and difficult to read. It looked like a journal entry describing a solitary writer hunched over a desk lamenting his isolation. My pulse hammered in my ears. An odd familiarity tugged at me as if I recognized the writer's thoughts I touched. The page, a flicker of images, foreign yet strangely intimate, flashed across my vision. Dusty candles, the scratch of a quill, the scent of damp parchment. My mouth went dry and I nearly dropped the book. I forced myself to breathe slowly, inhaling deeply to combat the tightness in my chest. I closed the volume, gingerly placed it back on the shelf, and then turned on every light in the apartment. Even with the brightness, I felt haunted by that fleeting vision, the sense that for a heartbeat I had merged with the mind of an unknown author from a time long past. Over the following week, things escalated in small but alarming ways. Each morning I discovered the book open to a new page. The paragraphs became more personal, describing not just the writer's experiences, but somehow referencing me. A man who couldn't sleep, who drank too much coffee, who dreaded the nights. I found lines that seemed ripped straight from my private journals, thoughts I'd never voiced aloud. Insecurities only I was aware of. My heart pounded with a sickening urgency every time I read these intimate confessions. Goosebumps peppered my skin and a tremor ran through my hands that I couldn't fully steady. I started locking the book in a small trunk I kept in my bedroom closet. I'd wrap it in an old towel, place it in the trunk, turn the key, and tuck that key in my sock drawer. Yet every time I awoke, I discovered the trunk wide open. The towel folded neatly to one side and the book resting somewhere in plain sight. One morning it was propped up on my kitchen counter, open to a passage that detailed my thoughts about the day's lecture. I felt a jolt of nausea. My breath came in ragged bursts as I realized these were not random journal entries. They were describing my life as I lived it. That same day I ran into the landlord outside my building, a stern-faced older man who rarely spoke. I mentioned the strange occurrences, though I chose my words carefully. Not wanting to sound unstable through indirect questioning, I tried to learn about previous tenants. He responded in short phrases, quietly acknowledging that people had left abruptly before their leases ended. He avoided eye contact, clenching his jaw, and his discomfort was palpable. He gave no explanation beyond saying some never even bothered to pack everything. Leaving items behind, he shrugged and walked away, leaving me with an uneasy pit in my stomach. Something told me he was well aware of the phenomenon but had no intention of helping me understand it. That evening, I tried to set up a small camera in the living room, aiming it at the bookshelf. I wanted to catch any movement on film, hoping that if I found a logical explanation like an intruder or a mechanical malfunction, I could put my mind at ease, yet my hands were slick with sweat, and I fumbled with the camera's cords. My heart thumped unevenly as I contemplated what I might find in the footage. I went to bed exhausted around 2 in the morning. A sudden chill woke me. The hairs on my arms stood on end and my breathing was shallow. I had that unmistakable sensation of being watched. My eyes darted around the darkened bedroom. The faint glow of the street lamp filtered through the curtains, illuminating only the faint outline of furniture. I felt a jolt of cold fear spread in my chest. I forced myself to move. Stepping out into the hall, that was when I noticed a thin flickering light coming from the living room like a candle's glow, except I owned no candles. I advanced slowly, heart pounding each step, feeling heavier than the last. My skin burned with adrenaline and every nerve screamed for me to turn back. Yet some twisted curiosity propelled me forward. What I saw next made me nearly collapse. The old book lay open on the coffee table, and above it, hovering in the air, were faint wisps of light. They trembled in and out of focus like ephemeral ribbons dancing in a breeze. I froze, a clammy sweat coating my forehead. My breath caught in my throat, the light pulsed. Once, then winked out. My apartment was dark again, only the street lamp glow remained. My legs felt weak and I had to brace myself against the wall. Slowly, I approached the book, flipping on the overhead light with a trembling hand. The camera I'd set up stood in the corner, the red recording light still blinking. I scrambled over to review the footage, but found only static. Whatever had happened, the camera hadn't captured it. I couldn't bring myself to look at the book anymore. That night, I threw a blanket over it as if that could stifle its power. Even then, I couldn't shake the image of those ghostly lights. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and a growing suspicion that reality was beginning to blur. My mouth was dry and my stomach churned with a mix of fear and urgency. The next day at work, I found it impossible to concentrate. My lectures were disjointed, and a colleague later remarked that I seemed unusually pale. I caught glimpses of my reflection in the hallway mirrors. My eyes looked sunken and ringed with dark circles. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was following me, pressing in from every corner. The squeak of shoes on polished floors sent my heart into frantic palpitations. Every time a phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Later that afternoon, I discreetly asked around about the apartment's history. One of the librarians, a quiet woman with keen insight, mentioned that the building had a reputation for incidents. She hinted that some occupants left behind not just boxes of belongings, but personal records diaries, even half-eaten meals. An eerie suggestion that they had vanished without warning. Hearing that made my skin crawl. My pulse thundered in my ears. The sense of living inside a nightmare became tangible. Back in my apartment, I realized I couldn't avoid the book any longer. There had to be answers within its pages. Perhaps it was an ancient text that latched onto a reader's psyche. Perhaps it was possessed by some malevolent force I needed to know. I sat down in the living room, setting a single lamp on its highest brightness. The shadows on the wall still seemed too long, too menacing, but I steeled myself and opened the volume. The text began as a simple journal describing an isolated scholar's descent into obsession. Then it shifted mid-paragraph to describe me, my sleepless nights, my anxious pacing, even my sweaty palms turning each page. My lungs felt constricted, and I had to consciously inhale and exhale to stay calm as I continued reading. A weird sensation overwhelmed me. I felt transported into the original writer's memories, a flickering candle in a drafty study, the scratch of a quill pen, the smell of moldy parchment, and a suffocating sense of desperation. My heartbeat thundered in my chest for a moment. I felt I was both there and in my modern apartment. My vision blurred and I nearly lost consciousness. The heavy weight of centuries pressed down on me as though I was living someone else's regrets and nightmares all at once. When I snapped back to my own reality, I was drenched in sweat, my chest rising and falling with uneven gasps. The book lay open on my lap, and I looked down to find new paragraphs forming as though an invisible hand was still writing. The words spoke of my confusion and terror, describing me in the moment, describing my racing pulse and trembling fingers. My stomach churned violently. I slammed the cover shut, but the words remained burned into my mind. For the first time, I seriously considered fleeing the apartment, yet part of me believed I couldn't outrun this thing. Whatever haunted the book seemed to have latched onto me. Panic rose in my throat. My vision blurred at the edges, and I felt a vertiginous tilt as though my equilibrium had been shattered. Desperate for some semblance of control, I took the book to the bathtub. I turned on the faucet, preparing to submerge it, hoping to destroy the parchment. Water thundered into the tub, echoing against the ceramic. My hands trembled so much I nearly dropped it before I was ready. A sense of raw dread clawed at my insides as if something within those pages pleaded for survival. My breath was shallow and cold. Sweat trickled down my temples. At the last second, a jarring wave of vertigo hit me. My vision darkened for an instant. I smelled candle wax and heard the scratch of a quill again. My muscles seized up and I toppled backward. The book fell from my hands onto the wet tile, narrowly missing the water. My body tingled as if electricity danced under my skin. I had the unnerving sensation that if I drowned the book, something in me might also drown my heart, hammered so powerfully that my ribcage hurt. Tears of frustration filled my eyes and I screamed into the empty bathroom I was trapped. The book's influence seeping into every corner of my life. Exhausted, I set it aside on the bathroom floor and slumped against the wall. Breathing heavily, at some point I must have drifted off when I came to the tub, was still running overflowing onto the tile. Water pulled around my ankles and I felt it soak my pants. My shirt clung to my chest in a panic. I shut off the faucet and reached for the book. It remained dry. The water had diverted around it, somehow almost unnaturally leaving it untouched. My mouth went slack with a mixture of awe and horror. A chilling thought took shape. This object wasn't just cursed, it was protected by something beyond my understanding. That night I resolved to leave. I packed my clothes, books, and papers, ignoring the soaked bathroom and the suffocating heaviness in the air. I felt eyes on me from the shadows, but forced myself to ignore that crawling sensation on my neck. My heart rattled in my chest, the adrenaline making my hands shake several times. My knees nearly gave out. I refused to glance at the coffee table as I made my escape. Finally, I stuffed what I could into my car and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The street was eerily silent. Even the night sky seemed void of stars. I started the engine, but a sudden wave of apprehension made my breath catch my eyes. Flicked to the rear-view mirror in the back seat, I saw the blurred outline of that leather-bound volume. I heard no rustle of pages, but it was there. Resting in the darkness, my stomach flipped and my throat tightened with dread. I hadn't brought it out. It had come anyway. I nearly drove off the road in panic, but managed to swerve back. My heart hammered so violently I felt dizzy. The car idled by the curb, headlights illuminating the empty street. I fought to steady my breathing slowly. I looked back at the mirror. The book's silhouette remained with trembling resolve. I fixed my gaze on the road ahead. I drove. Maybe I was fleeing, or maybe I was running towards some final confrontation, I don't know, but as I left the building behind, I sensed the weight of countless vanished tenants bearing down on me. All those personal items they'd left, all those unanswered questions. The book had come with me, and there could be no real escape, only a grim acceptance of what it represented. For a moment, I felt a jarring calm. My heartbeat slowed from a frantic drum to a tense, steady beat. My breathing evened out, fear still coiled in my gut. But I found a sliver of determination. If the book was bound to me, then I would endure it, and perhaps unravel its mystery. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road in a cold yellow glare. My palms were still slick on the steering wheel and sweat trickled down my spine. Yet I gritted my teeth and pressed forward. Part of me wondered if I would end up like the others, forced to vanish, leaving behind only my possessions and a trace of confusion. Another part, the stubborn professor in me, believed knowledge was my key to surviving. Even if the book contained some twisted echo of past lives, maybe I could break the cycle or at least confront it head-on. That unsettling possibility held a glimmer of hope amid the cloying darkness. By the time I reached the highway, a strange hush settled over me. The last images I had of my apartment were of wet tiles, flickering lamps, and the oppressive silhouette of that ancient tome. Now it was with me, quietly humming in the backseat like a dormant storm. The tightness in my chest loosened, but only slightly. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. The world outside was bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Everything looked surreal, as if part of an elaborate stage set. I felt no triumph, only a stubborn resolve. I gripped the wheel and stared into the night, uncertain of what lay ahead. My pulse throbbed in my veins and my skin prickled whenever my thoughts turned to the future. I might never be free of that book's grip, but I was still here for now. That had to be enough somewhere. Within me, a chill certainty took root. The story wasn't finished. The book would keep writing itself. It might record my every move, my every shuddering breath, my every faint glimmer of hope. But I, Peter Nichols, had chosen to remain, to challenge it, to keep driving forward. And though my body still trembled with fear, my heart pounded with a resolve that no ancient force could easily erase. I would not vanish without a fight. I would not abandon my life to a cursed journal. Whatever nightmares awaited me, I intended to meet them. Hidden in that moment, a subtle hush fell over the night air. The hum of the engine lulled me into a tense calm, and I felt more alive than ever. My breaths were shallow but purposeful. My skin still tingled with residual terror, and as the highway stretched ahead dark and endless, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. A beginning steeped in dread, yet electrified by the knowledge that I still had my own will, and that perhaps was the most unsettling realization of all. The thing that feeds on your terror does not necessarily need to destroy you to claim victory. It only needs to share your life story until you can't tell where it ends, and you begin with that realization echoing in my mind. I drove on the book in the back seat, its pages sealed for now, its power still thrumming in the darkness. It was a horrifying awareness, yet somehow in that awareness I found the raw determination to keep going, and for me that would have to suffice. Story 8. The moment I first laid eyes on the stone, I sensed a weight in the air as though it radiated a cloying gravity that pressed against my lungs. I remember standing in that half-lit storage room at the university's archaeology department, the fluorescent tubes flickering overhead. My heart pounded, and I couldn't tell if it was excitement or an irrational unease thrumming in my veins. That unsettling pressure only intensified when I noticed the faint smear of crimson trailing down one side of the stone, so dark that it seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Even before I knew its full significance, I felt the chill of premonition, like I was on the precipice of something that would change me forever. I am not a man given to superstition. Over the years, my work as an archaeologist has led me to handle ancient artifacts rumored to be cursed or haunted. I've calmly cataloged them, shipped them off to museums, and never lost a minute of sleep. This stone was different from the start. There was an odd magnetism that drew me in. At first, I thought the subtle movement I perceived was merely an illusion caused by shadows cast from the shaky lighting in the warehouse. But the more I observed it, the more I became certain that the stone wasn't staying in the same exact position. Each day, I could have sworn it shifted a fraction of an inch whenever I turned my back. It was so slight and so improbable that I questioned my own senses several nights later. As I prepared the stone for basic analysis in my personal study, I discovered it produced a thick red liquid that glistened like fresh paint. It slowly trickled from fissures in the stone's surface, and whenever it touched my work, it left stains that wouldn't wash away. No matter how hard I scrubbed, I felt a flutter of alarm in my stomach. I had never seen anything like this. The color consistency and the chemical composition. Once I started testing, it simply made no sense. The strangest part was how it seemed to appear only in the moments I wasn't watching it closely. I would turn away to retrieve a tool, and then I'd return to find that ominous fluid smeared across the table. In those early days, my nights became unsettled. I experienced vivid dreams of torchlit ceremonies and chanting in a language I didn't recognize, at least not consciously in these dreams. Masked figures surrounded towering altars, their silhouettes flickering against walls covered in strange symbols. My heart rate skyrocketed every time I woke up, but the visions evaporated the moment I tried to recall the details. I'd be left with a racing pulse, sweaty palms, and an almost desperate urge to go check on the stone. Even my appetite changed. I felt a constant twisting in my gut as though I'd swallowed shards of ice. Then the electronics started picking up bizarre interference. I had set up a high-resolution scanner in my office, hoping to get 3D images of the stone surface. Instead, the scanner's microphone began capturing faint whispers. There was static punctuated by what sounded like hushed chanting colleagues who overheard the recording. Said it reminded them of archaic dialects from Mesoamerican cultures. When I consulted a linguist specializing in ancient scripts, he mentioned it sounded reminiscent of Nahuatl, though the dialect was older than any he had studied. Hearing his assessment left me with a cold, creeping sensation that ran from my scalp down to the base of my spine. It felt as though I were prying open a door best left sealed. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps there was an audio glitch or electromagnetic interference, but my equipment was brand new and had never malfunctioned before. I noticed something else. The potted plants around my office began to wither. Despite me watering them regularly, their leaves yellowed, then turned brittle and brown. Within days, when I examined the soil, it looked lifeless, as though no nutrients were left. My body tensed each time I saw another wilted leaf. It was too quick, too unnatural. That persistent ball of dread in my chest started growing heavier. Around this time, the dreams escalated. It wasn't just nighttime visions anymore. I started experiencing strange episodes of trance-like states during the day. My colleague from across the hall observed me staggering around my office, chanting under my breath in a tone that seemed alien to her. She told me later in a voice tinged with anxious concern that I appeared possessed or entranced. Though she hesitated to use those words, I had no memory of any of it. My knuckles sometimes felt raw and bruised, as though I'd been scraping them against something rough and uneven. One morning I found a makeshift altar in the corner of my office. It was constructed from stacks of old textbooks, pieces of shelving, and a few of my personal trinkets. All of it was meticulously arranged around the stone, which had somehow moved from its locked storage box to the center of this improvised shrine. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the dark red stains on the floor beneath the stone, forming a disturbing spiral pattern. I had no recollection of building such a structure. A wave of nausea and panic spread through me. The hair on my arms stood on end and my vision blurred for a moment. I felt my heart thudding in my chest, blood roaring in my ears. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for a second I thought I saw faint shadows moving along the walls, desperate for an explanation. I consulted a handful of peers. I tried to avoid explicit details and limited my direct descriptions to them, focusing on the stone's odd properties and the unsettling artifacts around it. Rather than my personal experiences, one of them muttered something about sacrificial rites and a misguided attempt at gallows humor. Another reminded me that materials from certain sites in Central America were rumored to be used in ritual contexts that involved blood. Their remarks felt like cold nails tapping on my skull. If the stone had participated in ancient rites, if it was a conduit for something beyond my understanding, then what had I brought into my life? Sleep became impossible. I dozed off for mere minutes at a time, only to jolt awake drenched in sweat and gasping for air. My office, once a familiar space, now felt stifling and claustrophobic. The overhead light seemed too dim. My footsteps echoed ominously across the tile, and every rustle of paper made me jump. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced there was a presence hovering just beyond my field of vision. My reflection in the office window startled me on more than one occasion. My eyes looked sunken and hollow, as though I were fading into a living corpse. Yet I remained alive, trapped in a cycle of exhaustion. One evening, while trying to document the stone's condition, I decided to set up a camera. Something in me thought that if I could capture its movements, I might regain my grip on reality. Watching the live feed, I saw nothing out of the ordinary for almost 2 hours. The office was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. Then I heard a faint scraping sound that made my breath hitch. The camera wavered as if the very air had become charged with static. When my vision refocused, the stone had shifted a few inches forward. A thin rivulet of that red fluid spread under it like a slow leak. My stomach lurched, my pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt slick sweat trickling down my temples. The fear was so sharp it made my skin prickle. I realized my hands were shaking uncontrollably when I attempted to zoom in. A series of faint whispers crackled through my computer speakers. The chanting was unmistakable. Now more pronounced, I felt the heaviness behind my eyes intensify as though invisible fingers were pressing against my skull. My body grew cold and I could barely draw a breath. It was an uncanny sensation of being watched, scrutinized, and slowly drawn into something ancient. My mind reeled with half-formed thoughts of ancient rites and dark incantations. Suddenly, I noticed the potted fern in the corner drooping its leaves, losing their vibrancy by the second it was happening before my eyes, as if the life was being drained out of it. I tried to speak into the camera's microphone, half praying that the stone would react, or that the chanting would subside, but my voice came out as a strained rasp, barely audible. I felt a jolt behind my eyes like a spike of ice, and then everything went black for a moment. The next thing I remember, I was hunched over my desk, fingernails, cracked arms, stiff and trembling. The camera feed showed that nearly 20 minutes had passed. My entire body quaked with an unnameable terror, and a numbness spread through my limbs, as though I'd been shoved into a vat of freezing water. Terrified, I moved the stone to a locked cabinet in the archaeology lab, hoping to create some distance, but even that didn't help. My nights were plagued by the same fevered dreams of chanting and flickering torches. I would wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst from my chest. My office still felt suffused with a sinister presence, a dread-laced tension twisted in my gut. Every time I passed the corridor that led to the lab, occasionally I would glimpse what looked like footprints in that sticky red fluid near the door, trailing off into the dark recesses of the building's basement. But they vanished if I tried to follow them. To combat the sense of powerlessness, I began researching anything I could find on ancient Natal practices late into the night. My eyes blurry and stinging, I pored over texts describing old rituals, altars, and sacrificial stones. I found references to objects believed to be living vessels for malevolent entities capable of draining life from living organisms around them. The word teal heart came up repeatedly in the transcripts I deciphered, always tied to a notion of sustaining an otherworldly force. The more I read, the heavier my chest felt. It was as though I were inviting the darkness to take up residence in my mind. The final straw came when I discovered that I'd been building small altars in other places too. My home's garage, the corner of a rarely used hallway in the research wing. I had no conscious memory of any of it. Yet the evidence was there. Items from my desk meticulously arranged in symmetrical patterns, all centering on scribbled drawings of the stone. The drawings were covered in that sinister red stain which bled through the paper and etched itself into the surfaces beneath. The shock of seeing them caused my chest to tighten. I started hyperventilating, my breath coming in ragged gulps. My vision swam and my muscles felt limp. The terror of realizing I was no longer fully in control of my actions set me on edge. Like never before, I decided I had to do something drastic. Quietly, I packed the stone in a reinforced crate and loaded it into my car. My hands were trembling as I maneuvered it into the trunk. My mind teemed with half-formed plans: bury it somewhere remote, toss it into a deep ravine, anything that might break its hold over me. The drive was nerve-wracking. Streetlights blurred into distorted halos, and every shadow on the roadside made me clench the steering wheel tighter. The chanting in my mind grew louder, an incessant susurrus that throbbed against the inside of my skull. Eventually, I reached a deserted stretch of land near a shallow ravine. My whole body felt cold, my lungs struggling for air as I hauled the crate out of the trunk. The box seemed heavier than before, as though the stone was resisting my heart, hammered with such ferocity that I felt it reverberating in my neck. Carefully, I pried open the box, intending to roll the stone down into the darkness of the ravine. But the moment I touched its surface, that red liquid streamed across my gloves, spattering the ground. The chanting in my head rose to a fever pitch. The world seemed to tilt for a fraction of a second. I saw dancing shapes around me, shadowy figures with torches. The wind felt hot against my face. Though the night air was cold, I forced myself to pull back with one final push. The stone toppled from my arms and into the darkness. I heard it clatter against the rocks below, the sound echoing in the stillness. My breath came in desperate bursts, and the chanting ceased so abruptly that my ears rang with the sudden silence. My chest heaved as I slumped to the ground, sweat chilling against my skin. Even though I had rid myself of the stone, a lingering dread saturated the air. The metallic odor of that red fluid still clung to my clothes. Cautiously, I made my way back to my car. During the drive home, I felt a disquing emptiness in my head, as though something had been ripped out, something that had sunk hooks into my psyche. Relief washed through me, but it was a tenuous, trembling kind of relief. Tainted by the knowledge that I might never truly be free of what I'd experienced in the days that followed, I tried to resume. Normally, my office felt less suffocating. The plant stopped dying so abruptly, and electronic equipment no longer picked up that eerie chanting. Yet I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that part of me was missing, like a gap in my memory or a cavity in my soul. The nightmares didn't stop entirely. Sometimes I still woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear sibilant whispers drifting through my darkened bedroom. I maintain a facade of composure for my colleagues. I file my reports, attend meetings, and engage in small talk about upcoming expeditions. But my hands still tremble when I remember the stone, slick red fluid staining my workspace, or the trance-induced altars I constructed in secret. Some nights a jarring flash of memory will make my heart race, glimpses of masked figures, their chanting echoing in my skull. Even now I'm haunted by a quiet dread whenever I pass that ravine, half expecting to catch a glimpse of a faint red glow or hear the distant murmur of ancient Natal. There is no proof the stone remains there undisturbed, but every rustle in the bushes, every flicker of moonlight across the craggy slopes feeds the fear that I've only delayed the inevitable. My life is irreversibly entwined with that object's malignant mystery. Some nights I wonder if a deeper ritual has already marked me, and if the stone is calling out to me still somewhere in the darkness, waiting for its next host to heed its whisper. I can't be sure. What I do know is that I can't erase the feeling of its presence pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I can still smell the coppery tang in my dreams, and sometimes in the murky silence before dawn I hear that faint chanting, as if carried on an ancient wind from a time best left forgotten. The lingering chill it sends through me ensures I never truly feel safe. Even now my heart clenches with unresolved terror, and I'm left with one overriding unsettling certainty. Whatever shadow I unleashed is still out there, flickering just beyond the fragile boundary of reality, ready to seep back into my life the moment I let my guard down. Story 9, I knew the moment I saw those vases that something was off. They were displayed on a long table in the corner of the small research station, each one shaped like an elongated cylinder with unnerving patterns etched into their surfaces. The air around them felt wrong, heavy and stifling, as though the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. I remember noticing that the fluorescent light above the table flickered in a slow, erratic pulse, as if reacting to the voices. Even from several feet away, I felt an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. Everything about them demanded my attention, yet warned me to keep my distance. I am an anthropologist by trade, always on the lookout for artifacts that might shed light on the lives and beliefs of ancient civilizations. When I first stumbled upon these vases in a remote mountain village, they were hidden away in a forgotten section of a local museum. Storage, the curator, a tired-looking man with a hushed voice, told me in passing that nobody knew their exact origin. He suspected they had been excavated decades ago from a nearby archaeological site, but never properly cataloged. There were no official records, no research notes. Only the silent presence of the artifacts themselves, though the curator did not say much directly. I caught his hesitation and slight discomfort. Whenever I asked about the vase's background, there was an unmistakable weight in the room, one that I initially attributed to the stale air and dim lighting. But as I moved in to examine the objects more closely, I felt a sudden wave of nausea. It subsided quickly, leaving behind a dull headache that I tried to ignore. I arranged to have the vases shipped to my temporary research station, which was a small bungalow equipped with basic field tools and an open workspace. When the vases arrived, I placed them on a wooden table next to my laptop, a handheld recorder, and various notebooks. Almost immediately, strange occurrences began. My phone battery, which had been full, drained down to zero in a matter of minutes. I thought it was some sort of technical glitch. Then the potted plant near the table developed brown edges on its leaves overnight as if it had been exposed to a toxin. I chalked that up to improper watering. Maybe I had forgotten to give it enough water, but as the week progressed, more peculiar. Details cropped up. The overhead light would flicker whenever I was near the bosses, and once my laptop completely froze with a piercing whining sound from its speakers. Each time I struggled to come up with rational explanations, clinging to the belief that every bizarre occurrence could be explained by mundane causes. At first I tried to focus on examining the vases themselves. They were made of a clay-like material, but the texture felt somehow wrong, colder than I expected, and more porous. Running my fingertips along the strange symbols carved into their surfaces made my skin prickle. The designs included spirals, jagged lines, and forms that resembled distorted human faces. There were also small grooves, as though something had been poured in or out of these vessels. By the third night in my bungalow, my sleep began to deteriorate. I tossed and turned, haunted by vivid dreams of a dark chamber deep underground. In these dreams, I was not alone. Hazy figures loomed at the edges of my vision, whispering in guttural voices about an offering. I would wake up each morning drenched in sweat, my heart thudding wildly and my nerves so frayed that I could barely hold my coffee mug without spilling it over. Time the dreams grew more intense. I started seeing glimpses of ancient entities, distorted silhouettes of figures dressed in unfamiliar robes. They beckoned me closer all the while, muttering phrases about sustenance, nourishment, and the necessity of blood during my waking hours. I tried to distract myself with notes and translations I poured over old texts that might match the symbols on the vases. Eventually, I found a partial correspondence in some obscure references to pre-Columbian belief systems. One footnote in a dusty manuscript suggested that certain cultures crafted receptacles to house spirits who required regular feedings to remain docile. At the time, I felt uneasy reading that passage, but I told myself it was nothing more than myth. After all, anthropologists come across plenty of frightening lore, and it usually has some rational explanation that ties back to cultural rituals still. My research took a more desperate turn when I woke up one morning to find a thick, sticky substance leaking from the top of each vase. It looked like tar, but had a dark red tinge reminding me of blood mixed with oil. The scent that drifted from these droplets was metallic and putrid. My instincts told me to get rid of the voses right away, maybe bury them someplace far away from the bungalow or return them to the museum. But a stubborn curiosity took hold if these objects were truly absorbing energy from their surroundings. I needed to understand how and why. That night I moved the vases into a separate room and locked the door. I intended to keep them out of my sight, hoping the distance would offer a reprieve from the nightmares. Instead, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a moaning sound that seemed to come from inside the house. My pulse hammered in my throat, and the hair on my arm stood on end when I mustered the courage to check. I found the door to the room ajar, the lock broken. The vases sat in a faint beam of moonlight, each one oozing that horrible liquid down its sides, creating irregular puddles on the floor. The sight made my stomach churn. My head started pounding again, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I were in the presence of something truly malevolent. I recalled that old manuscript, and the footnote about feedings. The notion of feeding a spirit with blood was unsettling, yet it explained the bizarre fluid and the continuing energy drain in a state of frantic anxiety. I rummaged through more reference materials. I uncovered a few fleeting references to voses, often called receptacles, in archaic texts that served as conduits for summoning or housing entities. One fragment described the containers as needing periodic offerings of blood to keep the spirits from lashing out at those who possess them. Another hinted that failing to provide nourishment would result in severe misfortunes, even curses that manifested as sickness or madness. I tried to keep calm even as the lights in my bungalow flickered like a dying heartbeat. I told myself that these were just coincidences, that I was reading too many spooky legends and letting them color my perception. But deep down, I sensed that something truly unearthly was unfolding. My heart raced whenever I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At times I heard scraping sounds in the walls or faint whispering in corners where no one stood. The stress weighed on me and I questioned whether I was losing my mind. Maybe the isolation, the lack of proper sleep, and my single-minded focus on these vases were distorting my reality. Still, I could not ignore the physical evidence plants kept dying within a few feet of the vases, their leaves turning black as if drained of life devices refused to work in close proximity. Even the basic flashlight I relied on for late-night illumination started malfunctioning when I brought it near those vessels and that thick, viscous liquid that wept from the rims. There was no mistaking the odor or the sense of revulsion it inspired. One early morning, I decided to test a hypothesis. I took a small sample of my own blood, just a few drops from a sterile needle prick, and carefully smeared it along the groove of one vase. I can still feel the dread that knotted my stomach as I watched the blood get absorbed into the clay. The lines seemed to glow faintly for a brief moment, and the stifling atmosphere in the room shifted slightly as if something had just sighed in satisfaction. My exhaustion was so profound I nearly passed out from the tension alone, but to my astonishment the leaking fluid receded that night and I slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. This relief did not last. Over the following days I realized the vases were hungrier than ever. The flickering lights returned. The plants by the windows wilted faster and the moaning at night grew louder. I was now convinced that these artifacts were not mere ceremonial vessels. They were living conduits for restless spirits siphoning energy from anything nearby, unless appeased with a more potent offering. As I studied the inscriptions more thoroughly, I deciphered a chilling warning. The text implied that the vases must never remain unfed, or the spirits within would wreak havoc on those who dared keep them. I remember trembling as I parsed each cryptic symbol, trying to make sense of the archaic script. The words hammered home the necessity supply blood, or face the consequences. I wrestled with the moral implications. Even though I was alone, I knew I could not simply walk away without dealing with the problem. There was a creeping sense that once these spirits had latched onto me, they would follow me wherever I went. Abandoning the Voses seemed like it would only invite their wrath or spread their curse to someone else, so I steeled myself for a confrontation, determined to face whatever was haunting me. My heart pounded so intensely that my vision blurred. At times, my palms were clammy and each breath felt ragged as if the air had thickened around me. Nighttime brought the worst of the phenomena. The wailing sound intensified, echoing through the corridors of the bungalow. I placed the vases in a makeshift circle of salt. A superstition I vaguely recalled might ward off malevolent forces. I lit candles for some semblance of comfort. The walls felt as though they were closing in on me, shadows crawling across the floor in twisting shapes. I was sure I saw them flicker in response to the candlelight, elongating into claw-like forms that reached for the vases. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat a countdown to something I could neither predict nor stop. That night I had an especially vivid nightmare, or perhaps it was more of a vision. The same robed figures encircled me in a cavernous space. They stood behind massive stone altars pointing to the Voses and muttering about an ancient covenant. I heard them say in a voice that reverberated through my skull that those who possess the receptacles must honor the pact or face eternal torment. When I woke, my clothes were drenched in sweat, and I stumbled out of bed feeling like I had not slept a single moment. I decided I could not stay there any longer, at least not without a plan, gathering the vases in a large crate. I drove to an isolated spot in the nearby mountains. My hand shook on the steering wheel and my breath came in shallow gulps. Once I parked, I found a hidden nook among the trees. Away from any trail, the air felt cold. Despite the midday sun and the silence pressed down on my shoulders, I dug a shallow pit, mindful that this might not solve anything permanently, but desperate to separate myself from the artifacts the moment I placed them into the hole. A low humming, more felt than heard, coursed through my bones. The ground itself felt charged, as if reacting to the presence of those unholy objects. My entire body trembled with anxiety, and I nearly toppled into the pit. I covered the vases with dirt, building a small of rocks on top as a marker. My head pounded with the force of a high-pressure headache. and I tasted copper in my mouth as if I had bitten my tongue. Every instinct told me to flee, to put as much distance as possible between me and the Voses. Yet I hesitated, wondering if burying them would truly sever their hold on me, or if it merely delayed an inevitable consequence. When I drove back, I found I could breathe a bit easier. The house was quiet, and the flickering lights did not greet me. I slept that night without waking to moans or nightmares. Still, I felt no true relief. There was a persistent sense of being watched. The corners of my vision often shimmered as though something were lingering just out of sight in the silence of the dark. I sometimes caught a faint sound like distant crying from beneath the earth, or maybe just my own imagination playing tricks. Days passed, and I continued to wait for some final sign that the Vazi's power had dissipated. Sometimes I found my hand instinctively drifting to the spot on my arm where I had drawn blood. A subtle ache pulsed there, as if the wound were calling me back to those hungry vessels. I tried to dismiss the notion, focusing on other tasks and cleaning up the bungalow, but my nerves remained raw. My body still wired for danger. Even the slightest creak of the floorboards made me jump, a cold sweat springing to my forehead. Eventually, I packed my belongings. Determined to leave the research station, I told myself I had done my best. Gathered what data I could contain the threat by burying it, and yet as I drove away I felt certain I had not rid myself of those spirits. My heart raced and a tremor ran through my hands the more distance I put between myself and the mountain site. The more I wondered if distance mattered at all when dealing with such forces. The words from the inscriptions rattled in my mind, warning of consequences for those who neglected to feed the spirits. The memory of that sticky, blood-tinged liquid clung to me as if staining my thoughts with dread. Now, whenever I close my eyes, I see faint silhouettes dancing behind my eyelids, like after images of those robed figures from my dreams. I catch myself turning around at the slightest noise, half expecting to see the Voses there in the darkness, silently draining the energy from my surroundings. My heart still pounds whenever a lamp flickers or a device glitches unexpectedly, and my pulse spikes at every unexplained moment of silence. In a room, a lingering paranoia and gnaws at the back of my mind. Maybe the spirits have followed me, sustained by that single taste of my blood. Perhaps they live in the very shadows around me, waiting to remind me that their appetite has not been sated. I live now in a state of uneasy vigilance. I have told no one. The full extent of what happened worried that they would either call me insane or worse, seek out the vases themselves. I can only hope that the earth keeps those artifacts sealed away out of sight and out of reach, and that the malevolent entities within never find a way to emerge. Yet every night when the darkness settles in and the quiet becomes absolute, I feel them lingering in the corners of my mind, restless and eternally hungry, and in those moments a single thought echoes in my head like a warning bell once awakened. These spirits never truly rest. Story 10, I can still hear them even now, those nameless pleading voices echoing in my mind like a dissonant chorus. Every corner of my studio feels charged with an unsettling energy, as if my own music were just a faint backdrop to something much darker. It's odd how it started so innocently with a single reel-to-reel recorder. I picked up at a flea market, the kind that looks like it should be locked away in an antique shop. I never expected that unassuming piece of old equipment to unravel my sense of safety or reality. Yet here I am, heart-pounding, breath-shallow hands trembling over the mixing console, afraid to press the record button again. I'm a session musician by trade. My life revolves around capturing the perfect note-layering tracks until every bar is pitch-perfect. I'd been struggling financially and thought the flea market find might be my ticket to something unique, a way to add authentic vintage warmth to my recordings. The woman who sold me the recorder said it had belonged to a relative who was deeply passionate about music but left behind unfinished work. She seemed eager to get rid of it, though at the time I assumed she just wanted quick cash. Her stiff manner and darting eyes should have been a warning, but I dismissed my unease as buyer's remorse or simple superstition. When I first set the reel to reel up in my home studio, I admired its weighty design and the mechanical charm of its spinning reels. My house was dimly lit with a single lamp throwing uneven shadows across the walls. The air felt a bit stagnant, as if something lingered in corners I never bothered to dust. I plugged the recorder in, ran a quick microphone line, and prepared to test it out. Despite its age, it powered on without protest, motors humming with the faint smell of dust burning off. I remember feeling a quiver of excitement, anticipating the discovery of a new texture for my music. At first, the track I played back sounded almost normal. There was a slight hiss and crackle, exactly the kind of vintage vibe I hoped for, but underneath my guitar chords I caught the faintest trace of a second voice. I leaned into my headphones, heart accelerating in an instant. The sound was too distorted to be sure of its source. It might have been electrical interference or a random artifact from the old tape. I tried to shake it off, blaming the degraded reel, yet a strange pressure settled at the base of my neck as though something unseen was leaning over my shoulder. Listening with me night after night, the phenomenon grew more pronounced. I'd record my guitar lines or a short improvisation, then discover chilling harmonies woven beneath the notes, soft, mournful, and definitely human. I started hearing what sounded like multiple individuals layering their voices in a low hum, cresting at times like a wave of quiet despair. My breathing became ragged. The more I listened, each playback leaving me with shaky hands and an uncomfortable sheen of cold sweat on my forehead. I tried adjusting the cables, the mic, anything to remove the unwanted noise. Nothing worked. The first time I became genuinely frightened was when I noticed a new instrument on the tape that I never played, an otherworldly violin passage that matched my chord changes perfectly, as though orchestrated by someone intimately familiar with my music. Its phrasing was precise, yet filled with raw emotion like a lament. This was a track I'd recorded alone in my locked studio using no overdubs whatsoever. I replayed the part over and over, ears straining for an explanation. My pulse thundered in my ears so loudly that I almost missed the hushed words embedded in the final measure. They were faint but unmistakable, a soft entreaty that sounded like someone asking in anguished tones for a song to be finished. It wasn't a language I fully recognized, but the pleading nature was clear. Something in that disembodied request made my throat constrict. My mouth went instantly dry, my lungs stuttering with short, shallow breaths. I turned off the recorder, turned off all the lights, and hurried to my bedroom, leaving the entire rig behind. That night I could hardly sleep, half expecting to hear that violin from beneath my floorboards. I told myself I was just overworked. The next day I decided to switch back to my modern digital workstation. No more messing around with outdated machinery. I resolved if something truly haunted that old realtor, I wanted no part of it. But even with the vintage recorder unplugged, I heard the same eerie violin lines creeping into my new, purely digital tracks. My heart kicked into a gallop. When I listened closely, I distinguished more voices than before. Soft sobs whispered, "Please," a sudden swell of breath that made me tear off my headphones in alarm. It was as if that ancient hardware had found a way to cling to every wire and circuit in my studio, saturating the air with those spectral additions. At that point, I began to suspect the presence of multiple entities, people, or perhaps echoes of them, desperate to communicate. I discovered fleeting references to incomplete songs, each composition abandoned at a point where the tension of the chord progression was at its highest. The voices grew stronger whenever I tried to play around with those chord changes. My stomach cramped with dread each time I recognized the pattern. An electric hush settled over the studio whenever I prepared to record, as though anticipating that the next note might unlock something that had remained unfinished for too long. Over the following week, my anxiety levels skyrocketed. I rarely left the house except to buy groceries or coffee. The blinds stayed drawn and the studio's interior took on a tomb-like quality. Every wall seemed to hum with potential sound, reminding me that my attempts at music were no longer mine alone. My heart would race whenever I heard a subtle click or a static pop, convinced it was one of those voices trying to break through. I'd sweat so profusely that I had to keep a towel around my neck, wiping at the cold clamminess soaking my skin. The worst part was feeling like someone or multiple someones was watching me from the corners of the room just out of sight. If I dared to try finishing one of the chord progressions the voices seemed to crave, I'd experience immediate bodily reactions. My throat would tighten, my lungs struggling for air. My fingertips would tremble so badly that I could hardly press the guitar strings. My scalp would prickle, as though a cold breeze had blown across my head in those moments. I could hear them more clearly than ever, as if they crowded around the microphone, each vying for a chance to be heard. Their voices mingled like a sorrowful choir, each tone distinct, each presence urgent. They didn't speak in full sentences that I could easily translate, but the emotional weight behind the sounds was crippling. Friends began calling curious about my radio silence. I often let the phone go to voicemail when I did pick up. I spoke in a shaky, half-hearted way that worried them. One friend insisted I was just too isolated, urging me to take a break. I considered sharing the truth that some unearthly phenomenon had hijacked my entire setup and was begging me to finish incomplete pieces of music. But how do you explain that without sounding unhinged? Instead, I invited a single trusted friend, a fellow musician, to come over and witness the disturbances in my desperation for validation. I set up a fresh session in my digital audio workstation. The old realtor locked away in a closet. The atmosphere in the studio felt oppressive as we sat in the faint glow of a single overhead light. My heart hammered against my ribcage. My palms were slick with cold sweat. Right before I hit record, I noticed a rapid, hushed whisper in my headphones, as though the voices recognized an intruder. My friend asked me if the cables were loose or if I'd left some effect running. I shrugged, pretending ignorance, but inside my stomach churned as if a nest of snakes were alive in my gut. I pressed the record button and began to play a simple progression on my acoustic guitar. At first, everything seemed normal, then the meter on the screen started jumping erratically, capturing frequencies we weren't producing. My friend gave me a side glance, eyes widening. He wasn't hearing the voices yet, but the expression on his face confirmed. Something bizarre was taking place. By the time I stopped, the entire track was peppered with soft moans and faint inhuman harmonies that caused him to stiffen. He quietly asked if I had recorded any samples beforehand. I just shook my head, a tightness in my jaw that left my teeth aching. We listened back to the track in stunned silence as the moans grew in intensity right near the end. We heard that violin again, crystal clear and sorrowful beneath it. A single word, unfamiliar yet strangely anguished, surfaced, sending a chill down my spine. My friend hurriedly made an excuse to leave. Looking pale and rattled, he claimed he needed to check something at home. I didn't blame him before he walked out. He suggested I get the equipment examined by a specialist, though he avoided meeting my eyes. I knew he was terrified by what he heard. Being alone again felt like entering a lion's den. Every noise amplified. The overhead light flickered for a moment, creating elongated shadows on the walls. My breath started coming in ragged bursts. I stared at my reflection in the black mirror of a powered-down monitor, half expecting to see someone else behind me. The fear had taken on a life of its own, gnawing at my nerves, leaving me perpetually on edge. One day, desperate for answers, I dug into the history of the realtor. I wanted to find out if previous owners had ever mentioned such phenomena. My hands shook as I flipped through old receipts, and worn notes hidden among them was a cryptic page that outlined half-completed musical compositions, chord progressions that ended abruptly, and scribbled notations about unusual voices or phantom strings. None of it confirmed anything concrete. It only fueled my panic, yet a single line stood out. "They can't rest until the music is done." That phrase tormented me. I tried to imagine what rest could mean in this context without referencing anyone passing away. It seemed to suggest these voices were suspended in some incomplete state, tethered to the recorder or to the music itself. It dawned on me that maybe the only way to rid my studio of these haunting presences was to finish the compositions they had started. But the idea of actively collaborating with these unknown forces sent a wave of nausea through me. Over the following days, I inched closer to attempting it. I set up my digital audio workstation, turned off every external device, and double-checked all connections. Then, in a trembling voice, I announced to the empty room that I would try to complete one of the chord progressions. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. My tongue felt thick and my breath came in shallow gulps, even my vision blurred. Slightly as adrenaline coursed through my veins the moment I placed my fingers on the keyboard to begin the overhead light, dimmed, flickering just enough to cast dancing shadows on the walls. An oppressive silence fell, making the room feel smaller than it was. I started with the original chords from the cryptic page, each note resonating with an almost sentient weight. The voices emerged softly, a faint hush at first, then gradually swelled into layered harmonies. My hand shook, sweat dripping onto the keys, but I forced myself to continue as I approached the once-abandoned final chord. My head spun with dread, uncertain of what finishing it might unleash. I pressed the last few notes for a heartbeat. Time felt suspended. The chord hovered in the air like an impending thunderstorm. Then almost imperceptibly, the voices shifted into a collective sigh, a gentle resolution that sent goosebumps racing across my arms. A warmth emanated through the room, replacing the stale chill that had dominated for so long. My shoulders sagged with relief. Though I was still trembling from head to toe, I played the chord progression once more to confirm it was complete, and the voices settled into a subdued hum as if acknowledging a conclusion in the days that followed. The strange harmonies decreased in intensity. The random instruments that had snuck into my recordings quieted. I found myself able to sleep again, no longer expecting to hear forlorn wails or phantom violins echoing through the dark halls of my home. Yet I sensed that the job wasn't done, that there were more pieces awaiting completion. A chill spread along my spine whenever I thought about the other half-finished sketches scrolled on that cryptic page. Although the atmosphere in my studio felt less hostile, an undercurrent of tension remained, as if a single misstep could reignite the entire haunting. I continued to work through the incomplete compositions one by one, each time battling my own dread and the creeping paranoia that these voices had infiltrated something deeper than my gear, my very consciousness. Whenever I finished a piece, the voices would recede, replaced by a fleeting sense of calm, but only for a while. Eventually, I locked the Realtor and those faded compositions in a trunk, then stored it all in my attic. I reasoned that if I chose never to open that trunk again, the phenomenon might stay contained. But late at night, just before sleep takes me, I sometimes hear a distant echo of that sorrowful violin or sense a subtle shift in the air. It's enough to make my heart start pounding again. I wonder if the infection will ever truly leave the notion that these voices might still be waiting, hoping to pull me back into their unfinished realm. Keeps me in a perpetual state of vigilance. I haven't told anyone the full story. My friend who heard those moans and violin lines refuses to discuss it. He's hinted that perhaps we encountered something beyond our comprehension, and we both agree it's best left alone. Yet I can't erase the image of that final chord the moment it resonated with an eerie acceptance, as though bridging a gap between worlds. The memory lingers, feeding into my growing suspicion that the boundary between my music and something else was only blurred, never fully restored. I'd like to say I've escaped the nightmare, that everything is fine and my studio is back to normal, but I'd be lying each time I pick up a guitar or boot up my digital workstation. My heart drums an unsteady rhythm, expecting to hear those haunting voices again. Although they've quieted, they left a permanent imprint. My sense of reality is shaken. I catch myself flinching at random sounds or glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'll see figures drifting in the peripheral darkness. In the end, the real horror lies not in the unearthly music that invaded my recordings, but in the awareness that my creative space, a place I once considered a sanctuary, has become tinged with an enduring unease. I can't completely shake the feeling that at any moment a violin might soar out of nowhere, or a faint plea might slip through the speakers imploring me to complete yet another piece lost to time. The cycle may begin anew whenever I dare to create, so I go on day by day, choosing my notes carefully, keeping my sessions short. My pulse rarely slows in the studio, and my breath remains shallow as I record, always listening for that first sign of intrusion when I leave the room. I lock the door behind me, but the creeping sense of being watched lingers in every hallway of my home. No matter how many times I tell myself I'm free of the curse, I know a part of me remains tethered to those haunted frequencies, and perhaps that's the true terror. Realizing I might never again make music alone, even with the Realtor tucked away, even with the half-finished compositions presumably resolve something intangible, now accompanies my creativity humming quietly in the background. Whether it's purely psychological or genuinely supernatural, it doesn't change the fact that it's here beneath my skin, reminding me that some door was open the moment I pressed record on that ancient machine, and I'm not certain it will ever fully close again. Story 11, I still remember the exact moment when the air in my bedroom shifted from safe and familiar to something oppressive and crawling with wrongness. It happened in the middle of the night as a heavy silence pressed down on every corner of my home. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding so hard that the sound of my pulse seemed to echo in my ears. Before I even gathered the courage to move, I sensed a subtle dip in the mattress, like someone had settled down on the edge of the bed just inches from my feet. No one else was supposed to be there in those first few seconds, drenched in cold sweat. I felt the raw sting of an unexplainable presence. After that night, my life turned upside down the house. Once my refuge and creative haven grew into a maze of dark hallways and flickering shadows. I'm a writer by trade, used to conjuring images of fantasy and gloom in my work. I have a tendency to notice small details, but never did I imagine my perceptiveness would betray me like this. Now I cannot dismiss a single shifting shadow or half-heard footstep as a harmless creak of old floorboards. I find it hard to sleep at night because of the recurring sensations of movement, like a weight pressing into the mattress, always near my legs or hips. It is never abrupt. It starts with a gentle sag, a near imperceptible shift in the balance of my bed, and then the weight grows, making the sheets pull tighter around me. My pulse quickens to the point where I feel it hammering against my neck. In those moments, every breath is shallow and forced, coming in frantic gasps that leave my throat dry. I lie rigid too, afraid to roll over, unwilling to face whatever might be lingering in the darkness. At first, the disturbances were subtle enough that I questioned my own sanity. In fact, I tried to convince myself that fatigue and overwork were causing all these paranoid sensations. I even recall thinking that maybe I was suffering from some bizarre variant of sleep paralysis where my brain concocts illusions in the half-awake, half-asleep haze. But my illusions, if that's what they were, refused to confine themselves to the late hours of the night during the day. I started hearing those footsteps in the hall again, the same ones that had initially made my skin crawl late at night. Except now I would hear them at noon or early evening, pacing up and down as if someone was trying to map the layout of my house. The footsteps were heavy yet measured, as though the person walking had some specific intent. Whenever I rushed to the hallway, the sound would vanish, leaving me alone with my thundering heartbeat and that creeping sensation of being watched one afternoon. I decided to focus on my work, hoping to distract myself from the dreadful tension that was steadily building. I sat at my desk in the study, a cramped space filled with old books and manuscripts. As I was about to resume typing, I felt a sudden chill without warning. The hairs on my arms stood on end and my chest tightened. I turned slowly to look behind me. That was the first time I saw him in full daylight. The man from another era standing at the far corner of the room. He looked so out of place that my mind nearly refused to register him. He wore a dark suit styled as though he had stepped out of a late 19th century photograph. His hair was combed neatly back, and the faint lines on his face suggested a life of stern discipline. But what struck me the most were his eyes fixed directly on me with an intensity that made me feel cornered in my own home. They were cold, as if no humanity flickered behind them. My vision blurred for a moment from pure terror. Then, as abruptly as he had appeared, he vanished. I jumped up, body shaking violently. My lungs refused to pull in a full breath, and my head spun with the force of my panic. My clothes clung to me with cold sweat. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a ghost conjured by stress. Yet the memory of those eyes continued to coil around my thoughts. From that point on, he began appearing more frequently in the reflection of the hallway mirror in the distant corner of the living room, or standing at the top of the stairs. Whenever I glanced upward, he would stare right at me, never blinking, never speaking. The instant I tried to move toward him, he would vanish, leaving the house silent except for the sound of my heart thudding in my ears, as if his appearances weren't enough. My surroundings began to transform in subtle but undeniable ways. At first, it was the furniture in the living room. I noticed that my modern couch and coffee table were pushed aside, replaced by an antique settee battered and moth-eaten as though lifted straight from a century-old attic. But then I would blink and it would all be back to normal. Another time, the paintings on the walls changed where I had hung a series. Of modern art prints, I saw old portraits of stern-faced strangers dressed in fashions long extinct. I remember nearly stumbling over my own feet the day I noticed that the lighting in the hallway had dimmed to the soft glow of gas lamps. After a frantic scramble to switch the lights on and off, everything returned to its usual modern fixtures, but my relief was always short-lived. Eventually, I discovered my own clothes had been tampered with. I would go to my closet in the morning and find my t-shirts and jeans replaced by starched collars and wool trousers that looked like they belonged in a historical reenactment. Each time I would find them arranged with meticulous care as though someone had carefully curated an ensemble for me. I kept discarding these foreign garments, stuffing them into trash bags and dumping them in the garage, only to find more old clothes reappearing in their place. The sense of being unmet from time gnawed at my sanity. My heart raced constantly and I could practically taste the tang of metal in the back of my throat, a sign of my rising anxiety. My sleep became more and more restless. Night after night, I woke to the feeling of that weight beside me. My blankets would pull taut as though someone had shifted closer. I could hear my breathing ragged and laced with dread, and there would be the faint impression of a presence looming just above my shoulder. I told my closest friend about these incidents, though I avoided giving too many details in a strained, almost embarrassed tone. I hinted at strange occurrences in my house, instead of offering me comfort. He seemed unnerved by the desperation in my voice. He asked me if I needed to talk to someone, maybe a professional. His concern, though, meant only magnified my fear that I might be losing my mind. The weeks wore on and the activity intensified to an almost unbearable level. Some nights I would lie in bed paralyzed by dread, listening to footsteps ascending my stairs at a deliberate, unhurried pace. The pressure on the mattress would sink deeper as if more force was being applied. Cold sweat would trickle down my forehead and my lungs would feel constricted. Nearly refusing to expand, my room became a prison and I was a captive of my own terror. During the day, I tried to flee the house for hours at a time, hoping the oppressive atmosphere would dissipate in my absence. But whenever I returned, I found signs that something or someone had been there. Furniture would be rearranged in archaic formations. The color palette of the walls would look faded and yellowed, and the air carried a musty odor reminiscent of an abandoned estate. I became convinced that my home was metamorphosing into a place belonging to another age, piece by piece. My attempts to document these changes ended in frustration. Photographs came out blurry, and any video I recorded inexplicably vanished from my devices. At that point, the weight of isolation pressed down on me as heavily as the mysterious presence in my bed. My nights were filled with frantic racing thoughts. Could I be the cause of these manifestations? Had my own creative mind betrayed me, conjuring illusions so real that they reshaped my world? But self-doubt was only part of the nightmare. In one particularly harrowing incident, I was in the kitchen trying to force down some water to calm my frayed nerves. A stabbing sensation of being watched made me glance out the window, and there he was, the man from another era, standing in my backyard. This time he was closer than ever, dressed in the same dated attire, his expression unchanging, his gaze drilling into me. My knees nearly gave out. The glass in my hand slipped shattering on the floor when I looked up again. He was gone, but the lingering effect of his stare left me trembling uncontrollably, heart hammering against my ribcage as the nights grew darker and colder. I started leaving more lights on around the house, trying to dispel the shadows that seemed to welcome him. Yet no amount of illumination could keep him away. I would glimpse him in a brightly lit hallway or see his reflection in the mirror. Even with every lamp blazing, sometimes the corners of the room would stretch into unnatural darkness, no matter how many bulbs I replaced or how high the wattage. All the while, my body suffered the toll of relentless fear. My hands were almost constantly clammy, my mouth so dry I could barely swallow. My muscles ached from remaining tense for hours on end, as though I were bracing for an impact that never arrived. Sleep came in fitful bursts, and I would wake up gasping, my shirt soaked through with sweat. Everything escalated one dreadful night, when the footsteps on the stairs did not stop at my bedroom door but continued inside the room. I heard each deliberate step on the wooden floor inching closer and closer to my bed. My eyes remained clenched shut, my chest so tight I thought I might pass out. Then came the weight on the bed, heavier than before. Pressing the mattress down significantly, I felt a shift beside me, the blankets pulling across my legs with force. In the suffocating darkness, a wave of panic nearly paralyzed me. I forced myself to open my eyes. My vision adjusted enough to make out a faint silhouette sitting there. The man from another time, so close I could sense a chill radiating from him. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might explode for a split second. Our eyes met in them. I saw a bottomless void, a cold acknowledgement of my terror. He leaned forward as though to speak, but only silence came in a surge of desperate bravery. I launched myself from the bed, nearly tumbling onto the floor. My lungs burned as I scrambled to the door, throwing it open and racing down the stairs, not caring if I fell head first. The hallway lights flickered ominously and the walls seemed to close in on me. I was convinced if I glanced back, I would see him following, arms outstretched to drag me into whatever darkness he inhabited. I fled the house that night, stumbling outside into the cool air. My breath was ragged and my entire body trembled as though I had run a marathon. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my car engine, idling for warmth, flinching at every passing shadow. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Eventually, I decided I could not keep living in this cycle of creeping horror. My mind teetered on the edge of breaking. I thought about calling the police, but what could I possibly explain to them? No crime had been committed. No intruder had been caught. The next day, I mustered enough courage to step back into the house under the bright morning sun. It was eerily still and all the furniture was back to normal, but the same undercurrent of dread pulsed in the atmosphere, as if waiting for darkness to grant it power again. I resolved to confront whatever presence lingered there, determined that if I lost my sanity, I would at least do so on my own terms. I combed through the rooms, ignoring the sense of invisible eyes tracking my every movement. I forced myself into the bedroom and yanked open the closet once again. All my familiar clothing was missing, replaced by the old-fashioned garments. My breath caught in my throat. But I refused to flee in a moment of reckless resolve. I gathered every antique item, every vest, every battered top hat, every archaic lamp, and dragged them outside. As I did, I sensed a disturbance in the air around me, like the house itself was protesting. My heartbeat roared in my ears, and I felt a tingling in my limbs, a sharp warning that I was crossing a line. With trembling hands, I set fire to the pile. The flames roared to life, casting flickering shadows against the side of my home. My eyes watered from the smoke, but I stood firm, waiting for the last of those anachronistic possessions to blacken and crumble. Something lifted from the air at that moment, a heavy weight that had lain across my shoulders for weeks. By the time the fire died down, my nerves were shot and my muscles were quivering with a frenzied combination of fear and relief. I spent the rest of the day in silence, waiting wary of any sign that he might return as the evening came and darkness settled in. I braced for the inevitable footsteps, for the oppressive presence on my bed, for the archaic redecoration. But the house remained still even now. Whenever I close my eyes, I half expect to sense that unbearable weight beside me, to feel the mattress dip as he reclaims his place. My nights are quieter, yet my mind is far from at peace. I can't banish the memory of his cold eyes or the feeling that at any moment reality might twist back into that other time and space where he thrived. I live with the constant awareness that perhaps I didn't destroy whatever tethered him here. Maybe I only forced him deeper into the shadows I've considered moving, but there's no guarantee I could escape him by abandoning this place. Part of me fears that the manifestation isn't bound to the house at all, that it's tied to me in ways I can't comprehend. The thought gnaws at my sanity, keeping me vigilant, even in broad daylight. I dread the quiet moments, the lull of sleep, the passing reflection in a mirror that might reveal a silent figure standing at my back, and so I remain on edge, uncertain whether my final act of defiance drove him out or merely provoked him to bite his time. Each night I wait to see if the bed will sag under an unseen weight. My heart still races at the slightest creak of the floorboards. Even now, sitting in my study, I can't help but sense the faintest ripple in the air, like a subtle shift in time that beckons me to look over my shoulder. I choose not to. Instead, I breathe slowly, fighting the dryness in my mouth and the pounding in my chest. I tell myself that I won this battle, yet the hollow echo of that presence lingers. There is no closure here, no certainty. Only the lingering promise that he might return, drawn by the resonance of my fear, ready to reclaim my nights. I can never fully shake off the feeling that my reality remains poised on the brink of a timeless abyss, and all it would take is a single slip in my courage for him to step through once more. Story I remember the first time I laid eyes on that yellow fabric, how it seemed to glow under the dim lights of my workshop, an aura of unease clinging to every thread. The air was stale, unmoving, and each shadow along the walls stretched just a bit too long, like they were trying to reach me even before I touched the cloth. A chill danced up my spine as though something old and restless lingered in the corners of the room, waiting for me to make a fatal mistake. I should have trusted my instincts and left it where it lay, sealed away under layers of dust, but my curiosity won, and I picked it up. That was the moment my life swerved off its safe path and into the realm of waking nightmares. I'm a stylist by trade. Though designer might be more accurate, my career has always revolved around transforming fabric into wearable art, using textures and patterns to create something more than just clothing. The day I discovered the yellow cloth had started like any other. I was rummaging through an old box of vintage materials in a friend's attic, searching for a rare piece of inspiration my friend who collected antiques had mentioned. There were some interesting scraps from a distant estate sale. He had spoken in a half-joking tone, warning me that one particular piece had a strange history. I took his words lightly, after all. I've heard 100 tales about haunted garments and cursed fabrics. It's almost a cliche in my line of work, but the moment he gestured to the corner where a faded trunk stood in isolation, the atmosphere in the attic shifted. The air felt thick, like breathing through a wet cloth. When I opened the trunk, the yellow fabric was on top, right even under a coating of dust. It looked hand-dyed, the weave intricate but somehow unsettling. I found myself drawn to it, compelled to run my fingertips over the surface. The fabric felt cool and a faint tremor coursed up my arm. I wondered if maybe I was imagining things, but something inside me whispered that I was dealing with a relic that defied explanation. I told my friend I would take it off his hands, and he simply shrugged. He said he'd heard murmurs about the cloth's origin, that it might have belonged to someone who suffered terribly in the past. He didn't elaborate, preferring to give only the barest details, insisting he was just relaying rumors. I took it home excited by the prospect of using something so unique in a new design. A twinge of unease lingered in my chest, but I tried to suppress it, rationalizing that old fabrics often carry an aura due to their mysterious histories. Back in my workshop, I spread the cloth out across a long table. The light overhead flickered momentarily, and for an instant I thought I saw the pattern shift. My heart gave a small lurch, blinking. I waited, but it remained motionless, just a swirl of muted gold and saffron weaving intricate shapes. I told myself that the flicker was simply a trick of the poor lighting. Then I ran my hand over the material again, marveling at its softness, and felt a wave of dizziness. My vision blurred. It was as though I had stepped into someone else's memory, a narrow corridor with peeling paint, the echo of desperate footsteps on creaking floorboards. I jerked my hand away and the vision vanished. My pulse hammered in my ears and my breathing came in shallow, panicked bursts. Over the next few days, I tried to proceed with my usual routine. I pinned the fabric onto a mannequin, planning to create a daring jacket that would draw eyes at an upcoming show. Yet, each time I touched the cloth, I had the strangest flashes, hints of unfamiliar rooms, fleeting images of terrified faces, or the sound of a door slamming in a distant hallway. At first I told myself I was just tired, I hadn't been sleeping well, having spent late nights finalizing sketches for clients. But after the fourth or fifth episode, it became impossible to ignore. The cloth was doing something to me, planting images in my head that didn't belong there. I confided indirectly in a mentor of mine, explaining that I kept experiencing bizarre visions. Whenever I worked with a certain material, he suggested that maybe I was just stressed out, or that the fabric's dye might contain chemicals causing mild hallucinations. He recommended that I set it aside for a while, let my mind rest. I tried. I tucked the yellow fabric into a drawer and turned my attention to other projects, but I couldn't fully avoid it. My gaze kept drifting to that drawer as though it had a magnet inside. I'd hear what sounded like soft rustling from it, as if the fabric was shifting all on its own, calling me back the moment I tried to sleep at night. The memory flashes would intrude scenes of anguish and fear flickering like a broken film reel across the backs of my eyelids. Eventually, I couldn't resist the pull. I took the cloth out again, noticing how the pattern seemed slightly altered. Before, it had been a series of swirling lines. Now there were faint outlines of shapes that could almost be interpreted as figures. I found it impossible to look away, my heart racing, sweat beating on my forehead. The longer I stared, the more the shapes appeared to move, as though they were reenacting some silent, ghastly drama. I felt a chill spread through my chest, the air in the workshop suddenly freezing cold. My breath came out in rapid puffs, and I realized I was trembling. I tried to blink the visions away, but they sank into my mind, persistent as a nightmare. I couldn't wake from over the following weeks. The boundary between my memories and these foreign scenes started to blur. My hands had developed faint yellowish blotches, small at first, then gradually larger, like the color was seeping into my skin. It was as though the fabric was claiming me, merging my essence with that of its previous owner or owners. I began to recall events that never happened in my life. Arguments in a musty living room filled with antique furniture, frantic searches for something hidden behind walls, and an overwhelming sense of guilt I could never place. I'd find myself gasping awake from these nightmares soaked in sweat, my heart threatening to pound out of my chest. My reflection in the mirror looked haggarded, with dark circles under my eyes and a haunted expression I barely recognized. I realized I had to figure out more about where the cloth came from. I made calls, combed through antique dealers' records, and even visited a local historian to see if they knew of any legend regarding such a material. People offered half answers and vague hints. Some mentioned that a reclusive individual might have once owned a large collection of rare textiles. Others speculated about traumatic incidents that might have imprinted themselves on certain pieces. No one gave me a solid lead. All the while, my hands continued to change the yellow patches, spreading further up my wrists. I felt a hot flush of panic each time I glimpsed them, a nauseating mixture of horror and fascination. One afternoon, I was examining the cloth under strong direct light. The overhead lamp buzzed in protest, and the cloth's pattern seemed more vivid than ever. Intricate lines forming what looked like doorways, hallways, and contorted figures. My throat tightened, an unmistakable sense of something watching me settled in the room. I could almost feel a presence behind me, studying every breath I took when I spun around. There was no one there, but the hair on my arm stood on end, and a buzzing filled my ears. Suddenly, my vision tunneled. I was in a different room. Not my workshop, but somewhere else. An old house with flickering sconces. The wallpaper peeling in large yellowish flakes. I felt dread coil in my stomach, the sensation of being trapped. I heard a muffled scream, distant yet distinct. Then I heard my own voice echo in the corridor, though I'd swear I never made a sound. I snapped back to reality with a jolt, my heart hammering. My breath rasped like I'd run a marathon. I noticed the entire front of my shirt was damp with sweat, the workshop stiflingly hot despite the air conditioner humming in the corner. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. I felt nausea swirl inside me, and I had to close my eyes to keep from passing out. Days bled together after that. I struggled to work on anything else. My other clients' fabrics felt dull and lifeless compared to the potent lure of the yellow cloth. I spent hours just staring at it, studying every swirl and line, hoping to glean some clue that might ground me. Instead, I found myself slipping deeper into confusion. The cloth was no longer a mere object in my possession. It was alive in its own right, weaving its history with mine until they were inseparable. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of old horrors and my own recollections. I found it difficult to trust my memories, second-guessing whether certain events had truly happened to me or to someone else. My sense of identity fractured, leaving me perpetually on edge. The physical symptoms worsened. The yellowish blotches now reached my forearms, a sickly hue that refused to wash off. No matter how hard I scrubbed, I spent evenings hunched over the sink, scouring my skin with soap and hot water until it burned tears in my eyes. From a mixture of frustration and terror, the blotches remained. The pain was just another reminder that something unnatural was at work. Eventually, I decided I needed to confront this head. On one night, I spread the fabric out on a large cutting table and studied it under a single hanging lamp. The rest of the workshop in murky darkness. The tension in the air was suffocating my chest tight with dread. Yet I forced myself to press my palms flat against the cloth, ignoring the cold shock that passed through my skin. I focused on my breathing, the sound of my heartbeat drumming in my ears and the dim shapes dancing at the edge of my vision. I silently demanded that it show me everything, that it reveal its secrets so I could be free of this torment. The images assaulted me in a rush of color and sound. I saw a series of rooms drenched in that same sickly yellow doors. Slammed lights flickered and ghostly reflections peered back at me from cracked mirrors. I felt the anguish of someone searching for answers but never finding any. My heart galloped, breath-ragged temples pounding in sync with the flickering overhead lamp. The cloth felt alive under my hands, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. My entire body shook as though trying to reject the flood of sensations. Then, in a dizzying flash, I saw myself hunched over a table in my own workshop. The cloth split out in front of me, but from another angle, as if someone stood behind me. Quietly observing that image almost stopped my heart. When the vision subsided, I was left drenched in sweat, arms covered in the creeping stain that now inched up my elbows. My mind felt torn open, but I refused to let the madness swallow me. I was sure that if I kept going, I'd cross a threshold from which I could never return. So I forced myself to roll the fabric into a tight bundle. Ignoring how it almost seemed to writhe against me, I decided to lock it away in a trunk, burying it under other materials. If it truly had a consciousness, then maybe it needed to be contained for days. I refused to open that trunk. I poured all my energy into other work, anything to distract my mind. The blotches on my arms itched, and whenever I looked at them, I was reminded that the cloth's hold on me was far from gone, but at least I could function piece by piece, reclaiming some semblance of normalcy one evening as I was clearing off my work, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The workshop was silent except for the faint hum of a distant traffic light outside. My heart pounded my ears, strained for any sound. Nothing. I turned off the main light, leaving only a small lamp glowing in the corner. That's when I sensed movement near the locked trunk. My stomach dropped. The air tasted stale electric. Like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, the trunk stood still, no sign of anything physically moving. But inside my head, I heard the faintest whisper, like a plea or a warning. A chill clutched at my spine. I didn't dare open it. Instead, I backed out of the workshop, locked the door, and retreated to my bedroom that night. I lay awake in the dark, heart galloping, the sound of my own breathing amplifying every whispered fear. I wondered if it was truly over, or if the cloth would forever remain a part of me. My arms still bore the yellowish patches, a constant reminder that my bond with that cursed fabric might never be fully broken. In the days that followed, I vacillated between wanting to destroy it and fearing what might happen if I tried. I researched every possible method of disposing of haunted items, from burning to burying. But each story came with dire warnings of the repercussions. The more I read, the more my anxiety flared. I could already feel the intangible presence that the fabric carried. so I shuddered to think what might be unleashed if I rashly destroyed it. Instead, I opted for isolation, relocating it to a distant storage unit. I sealed it in a wooden crate, taped every seam, and tried to forget. Yet the memory never left me even now. There are nights when I wake in a cold sweat, the lines between my memories and those foreign visions still hopelessly blurred. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and swear the yellowish patches have returned, or maybe they never fully disappeared. My heart races, palms slick with fear as I struggle to breathe. I remind myself that I locked the cloth away, that it's no longer in my home. Then I hear a rustling sound or catch a faint whiff of that musty scent, and my paranoia explodes. I wonder if it escapes somehow, drifting back into my life, waiting for the next moment of weakness. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, though it gnaws at me. I can't deny that a piece of that cloth still lives inside my mind, tethering me to a past that doesn't belong to me. On the rare occasion I let myself think about it, I question whether the horrifying visions I experienced were truly the echoes of someone else's trauma or a malevolent force seeking a vessel. Either way, I know the images are imprinted on me, etched into my psyche like the pattern woven into that cursed fabric. Every so often I catch myself reaching for a vivid yellow bolt of cloth at the fabric store, my fingers tingling with the memory of that alien energy. My heart rate surges and a faint tremor courses through me. That's when I force myself to turn away, refusing to give in. But the fear remains pulsing in the back of my mind, reminding me that some doors once opened can never truly be shut. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the stain on my arms might only be the beginning of a deeper transformation, one that no amount of distance or locked doors can halt. Even so, I press on, continuing my work carefully, avoiding the slightest hint of yellow in my designs. It's the only way I know to move forward to maintain a semblance of sanity. But I can't ignore the lingering presence that sometimes brushes against my consciousness. Late at night, when the world is silent and my racing heart refuses to let me rest, I sense it, a whisper from that hidden crate, echoing my own unspoken dread. It's a faint call pulling at the edges of my awareness, reminding me that it still exists no matter how well I hide it. It's there, weaving its past into my future, one thread at a time. Story 13. The first time I noticed something was off. A late summer storm was raging outside. Lightning flickered through my living room window, and for a split second my reflection on the glass appeared warped. My silhouette curved like a man mid-dance in a smoky, archaic club. The thunder was distant, but the electricity in the air felt too close, humming against my skin. Maybe it was the vinyl I had, spinning some obscure jazz album I'd found in a dingy record store basement. Or maybe it was just my nerves on edge from too many sleepless nights, mixing tracks in the half-light of my cluttered apartment. But even then, as the storm rattled the frames on my wall, I sensed there was something more. That was the evening the real horror began. I'm a DJ by trade, mostly spinning at small clubs on the city's fringes. My place is cramped, a one-bedroom that doubles as a makeshift studio. Neon lights I salvaged from an old bar sign flicker along my walls. Cords coil around my furniture like vines. The constant hum of speakers and mixers is my lullaby. I breathe music, and for the most part I take it in stride if things get a little weird during late-night experiments. But these jazz records, they didn't just make me uneasy, they made my skin crawl. I found them in a dilapidated shop called Tremolo's Antiques, hidden behind dusty stacks of out-of-print vinyl. The owner told me in hushed and trembling tones that those jazz discs were rumored to capture not just instruments, but also stray voices. He said other customers had claimed they heard faint whispers between the trumpet solos and bass lines. He didn't phrase it as a warning exactly. He presented it more like a piece of trivia that might amuse an experimental DJ. I left with a half-dozen records, intrigued by the potential to sample something uniquely eerie. That night I set up my gear and started listening to track after track, hoping to isolate the rumored murmurs. The first time I leaned in with my headphones pressed tight, I caught the barest hint of a whisper. It was so soft I thought it might be a glitch or a rustle of my shirt against the microphone, but on the second listen, I froze. There were definitely words hidden beneath the layers of saxophone and brush snare. They formed something like "release us" not once, but multiple times, stretched through the hiss of static. A shiver traveled down my spine, my hands were clammy, and my mouth went dry. I tried to rationalize it as an artifact of old recording equipment. Sometimes older records had incidental echoes or ghost tracks, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that these were voices and they were begging for something. I swore I heard half-formed phrases, "please." That felt desperate, as if they were trapped and fighting to be heard. At first I laughed it off. I reasoned it was a marketing ploy or a weird audio phenomenon. Then I noticed subtle changes in my apartment whenever I played one of these records, like the room shifting in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The overhead light flickered in time with the faint horns, the faint odor of stale cigarette smoke drifted in the air, and sometimes I sensed a presence in the corner of my eye, a sort of intangible silhouette standing where there should have been empty space. I brushed it off as after images from the neon glow or illusions born of exhaustion. Still, I couldn't deny that something was happening. Things escalated when I decided to mix two of these strange jazz records together. I was looking for a haunting overlap of instruments, but what I got was a wave of static that shook my entire setup. The turntables hummed with electrical discharge, making the hair on my arm stand on end. My heart hammered as I heard a tremor in the air, like a vibration that traveled straight through my chest. In the corner of the room, a poster fluttered, then lifted off the wall for a split second before falling back down. I could hardly breathe. My pulse throbbed behind my ears, sweat beating on my forehead. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then everything returned to normal, if you could call that normal at all. I started noticing my pulse quickening, not just from fear, but from a strange excitement too. I wondered if I could replicate that moment. It felt insane. Any sane person would chuck those records in the trash. But there was a magnetism to it, a pull that I couldn't refuse the next night. I tried playing 3 jazz tracks in a very deliberate sequence. The result was more pronounced. I saw the edges of my coffee table rise from the floor by maybe half an inch, and the overhead bulb popped, showering the room in darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a prickling all over my skin, like a million tiny pins pressed against me. My veins buzzed with adrenaline in that darkness. For a fraction of a second, I was convinced I saw figures outlined in the gloom, swaying gently in the spaces where my furniture used to be. Word got around about my new mixes. A friend told me that some folks found the sound exhilarating, though a few had described having bizarre collective visions while listening. One claimed to see a swirling dance floor from decades past filled with men and women stepping in unison to an old jazz standard. Another reported being overcome by an almost painful urge to dance, as though compelled by invisible hands. Since the friend's story reached me in bits and pieces, I didn't think too much about it. At first, people love to exaggerate, but then I received emails and social media messages from strangers who swore they had the same visions. They all described the same speakeasy light club, thick with swirling cigarette smoke and flickering lamplight. It seemed too specific to be a coincidence. Curiosity became obsession. I listened to those records day and night, analyzing waveforms and cutting them up in my software, searching for the exact combination that triggered the phenomenon. I'm not sure what I expected to accomplish. Maybe I just wanted to harness that strange energy, but with every new experiment, my apartment responded more dramatically. Chairs scraped across the floor of their own accord. The temperature plummeted and shadows stretched across the walls at unnatural angles. Worse still, the whispers grew louder. I no longer needed headphones to hear them. They surfaced in the spaces between chord changes, urging me to continue to open some sort of metaphorical door, and I felt compelled to obey. Eventually, my neighbors noticed a few times I heard muffled knocks against the wall, followed by the kind of hush that implies they were whispering, concerned. One evening, I caught someone in the stairwell who asked in a roundabout way if I was okay. Mentioning that they sometimes heard me playing strange sounds through the shared wall, I mumbled something dismissive and hurried back into my apartment. My heart pounding, I worried they might call the landlord or the cops. Yet in a twisted way, I felt protective of those records as though they were mine to guard and nobody else could intervene. I woke at odd hours drenched in sweat, the faint echo of saxophones swirling in my head, my muscles tensed at the slightest noise, creaking pipes, car horns outside the hum of my fridge. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting in the corners of my vision. My reflection in the window grew more alien to me. I had to keep telling myself that I was the same person, that I hadn't changed. But deep down, I knew something fundamental was unraveling one night. I decided to go further than ever before. I dragged all my speakers into the living room, set up multiple turntables, and cued 4 of the jazz records in a carefully timed set. It was around 3 a.m. The city outside was quiet, the air thick with that particular hush that precedes dawn. I braced myself, clicked each turntable arm into place, and let the music surge. The effect was immediate. The apartment lights flickered wildly and the hair on my neck stood up. A tremor passed through the floor. My throat went dry as I felt invisible. Fingers brushing my arms, almost guiding me in a slow, deliberate sway. Then the voices rose above the music, chanting something repetitive, a phrase that sounded like "release us." A wave of panic hit me, but I couldn't tear my hands away from the mixer. My heart pounded so fast I thought it might burst. I was drenched in cold sweat. My stomach twisted in knots and a dull ache spread through my jaw from clenching my teeth too hard. The living room was transforming before my eyes. The worn carpet and scuffed furniture seemed to dissolve into the smoky haze of a long-defunct jazz club. Flickering sconces appeared on the walls where my neon strips had been, and phantom figures wearing vintage suits and dresses glided across an invisible dance floor. It was more than an illusion. It felt tangible. The smell of old cigar smoke filled my nostrils, and I tasted copper on my tongue as though the air itself was charged with some raw energy. My legs trembled and I nearly collapsed from the pressure I felt behind my eyes. The record needles crackled, spitting static, and for a moment the entire apartment was layered with the superimposed image of that ghostly club. I saw faces locked in silent laughter, couples dancing close and a band on a small stage, their instruments glinting under low golden lights. The whispering voices grew frantic, weaving into the music. My hands shook uncontrollably. Sweat trickled down my temples, and I realized the record speeds were changing. On their own warping the pitch, a saxophone wail bent into a distorted moan, and I heard that repeated plea, "Release us." Echoing as though I stood at the center of a cosmic hallway, the vibrations in the floor became violent, rattling everything from my glacier to the pictures on the walls. I couldn't stay upright. I staggered into the coffee table, bruising my hip, gasping for breath. The tension peaked, then exploded. The turntables abruptly stopped. Silence slammed into me like a punch to the gut, leaving my ears ringing. The flicker of the club overlay vanished, replaced by the mundane sight of my living room. My speakers fizzled, spitting one last crackle of static. I sat on the floor chest, heaving eyes burning with tears. I wasn't even aware I'd shed. My entire body was trembling so badly I could barely form a coherent thought in the aftermath. I paced the apartment in a frenzy. My heart wouldn't slow down, pulsing like a war drum. I turned off every piece of equipment, unplugged everything from the walls, and jammed the cursed records back into their worn sleeves. Then I just sat there, back against the wall, knees pulled to my chest, staring at them. My thoughts churned with confusion and a gnawing sense of dread. Part of me wanted to snap the vinyl in half and toss it all into the dumpster out back. Another part feared that if I did, I might trap those whispers forever, or maybe unleash something even worse. The next day, I left my apartment for the first time in ages. Trying to clear my head, I didn't go far. Just walked a few blocks to breathe fresh air and recall what normal life looked like. Cars zipped by, people chattered on their phones, neon signs buzzed overhead. I felt a growing paranoia, as if someone or something watched me from every shadow. My chest was tight and my palms stayed sweaty. The entire time it was like the world outside had turned alien after what I'd seen, or maybe I had turned alien to it back home. The silence pressed against me. Usually I live with background noise test tracks, loops, snippets of crowd ambiance for mixing, but I kept everything off. Even so, I could swear I heard faint jazz chords drifting in from nowhere, accompanied by an almost inaudible call. Release us, my breath caught in my throat, my pulse pounding so loudly that it drowned out coherent thought. I knew I had to make a choice, either bury this madness or confront it. Once and for all, my gut told me there had to be an exit, a final mix that could break the cycle or appease whatever lived within those grooves. So I meticulously studied the waveforms, layering them in a new arrangement that felt both dissonant and strangely harmonious. I performed the sequence with headphones on, trying to contain the effects so it wouldn't echo through the apartment walls. This time my chest tightened as I heard the crackle start. My eyes darted around for signs of levitation or shifting shadows. My arms shook with tension, but I pushed the stylus to the final track, forcing myself to hear it through the music rose to a cacophony swirling with frantic whispering. My body braced for that horrifying overlap of ghostly images, but instead the record produced a single piercing note that felt like it drilled straight into my skull. My eyes rolled back and my muscles tensed almost to the point of tearing. Then silence again, blinking in the dim light. My ears ringing, I realized nothing else had changed. My coffee table stayed solid on the floor. The walls remained unwarped. The sense of presence in the corners seemed to have retreated for the first time in days. I felt a measure of relief. My entire body sagged with exhaustion as I gingerly removed the headphones. Although my heart still thumped, the suffocating atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a quiet that felt almost peaceful. I don't know if I set them free or if I merely scratched the surface of a larger mystery. All I know is that since then I haven't dared to play those records again. I keep them locked in a cabinet hidden behind ordinary albums that don't carry any sinister energy. Occasionally I catch myself wondering if I should try to reach that place once more, if I should attempt to revisit that bizarre dance floor and the smoky illusions. But each time I think about it, I feel the memory of that gut-wrenching fear coil around my heart. My knees go weak and the sweat returns, as does that prickling sense that I might be inviting something back into my life that I'm not prepared to handle. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint melody beneath the hum of my apartment's appliances, and my chest constricts with the memory of unseen figures drifting across my living room, but I remind myself that I managed to break free. Once the question that keeps me awake is whether any sort of release is ever truly permanent. If those voices are still out there pleading to be heard, then perhaps they are waiting for someone else to pick up the needle and complete the sequence. And every time that thought crosses my mind, my pulse surges, my mouth goes dry, and I feel an electric shiver across my scalp that has nothing to do with the temperature. Even though I'm safe for now, I can't shake the uneasy certainty that the music never really stops. It only pauses, waiting for the next spin of the record.